Chapter 15 of Max Havelaar by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, composed by Sterne. Havelaar's predecessor had good intentions, but seemed to have been in some measure afraid of the displeasure of his superiors, had many children and no fortune, had thus preferred speaking to the Resident about what he called excessive abuses than describing them plainly in an official report. He knew that a Resident does not like to receive a written report which remains in his archives, and which may be afterwards a proof that he had been made acquainted in time with this or that wrong, whilst a verbal communication leaves him, without danger, the choice of paying attention to a complaint or not. Such verbal communications generally brought about a conversation with the Regent, who, of course, denied all and asked for proof. Then the men were summoned who had the boldness to complain, and creeping before the feet of the Regent, they begged pardon. No, that buffalo had not been taken away from them without payment. They certainly believed that double its value would be paid for it. No, they had not been summoned from their fields to labor without payment in the Regent's sawahs. They knew very well that the Regent would pay them afterwards handsomely for their labor. They had complained in a moment of groundless malice. They had been mad, and begged that they should be punished for such excessive disrespect. Then the Resident knew very well that he had to think about this revocation of the complaint, but it gave him nevertheless a nice opportunity to maintain the Regent in office and honor, and spared himself the disagreeable task of troubling the government with an unfavorable report. The rash accusers were punished by caning, the Regent triumphed, and the Resident returned to the capital with the agreeable consciousness of having again managed so nicely. But what was the Assistant Resident now to do when the next day other complainers announced themselves? Or, and this often happened, when the same plaintiffs returned and revoked their revocation? Must he again insert this affair in his memoranda, to speak to the Resident about it a second time, to see the same comedy played again, to run the same risk as before, to pass at last for a person who, stupid and malicious, was continually producing complaints that were to be rejected every time as unfounded? And what would become of the relationship so necessary between the first native chief and the first European functionary, when the latter seemed to give ear continually to false complaints against his younger brother? And above all, what became of those poor plaintiffs, after they had returned to their village, under the power of the district or village chief, whom they had accused as the instrument of the Regent's arbitrariness? What became of these poor men? He who could fly fled. Therefore were there many Bantan people in the neighboring provinces. Therefore were there so many inhabitants of Lebak among the rebels in the Lampong district. Therefore had Havelaar asked in his speech to the chiefs, "Why is it that so many houses are empty in the villages, and why do many prefer the shadow of the wood elsewhere to the coolness of the forests of Lebak?" But not every one could fly. The man whose corpse floats down the river in the morning, after having asked the foregoing evening, secretly, hesitatingly, and anxiously, for an audience of the Assistant Resident, he needs flight no more. Perhaps it may be deemed philanthropy to spare him a further life by consigning him to an immediate death. The torture was spared him that awaited him on his return to the village, and the stripes which are the punishment of every one who could for a moment think himself above the brute, and no inanimate piece of wood or stone, the punishment for him who in a moment of folly had thought that there was justice in the country, and that the Assistant Resident had the will and the power to maintain that justice. Was it not indeed better to prevent that man from returning the next day to that Assistant Resident, as he had given notice in the evening, and to smother his complaint in the yellow water of the Chidberang, that would carry him away softly to its mouth, accustomed as that river was to be bearer of the brotherly presents of salutation from the sharks in the interior to the sharks in the sea? And Havelaar was acquainted with all this. Does the reader understand what went on in his mind when he considered that his vocation was to do justice, that he was responsible for that to a higher power than the power of a government, that, to be sure, stipulated for this justice in its laws, but did not always like to see the application of it? Do you understand how he was perplexed with doubt, not of what he had to do, but of how he ought to act? He had commenced with moderation. He had spoken to the Regent as to an elder brother, and he who thinks that I, captivated with the hero of my history, try to extol too much the manner of his speaking, may hear how once, after such an interview, the Regent sent his pâté (a person in service of the Regent) to him to thank him for the benevolence of his words, and how again long afterwards this pâté, speaking to the Controller Verbrugge, after Havelaar had ceased to be assistant resident of Labec, when nobody had anything more to hope of or fear from him, how the pâté at the remembrance of these words had been touched, and cried, "Never as yet any gentleman spoke like him." Yet he would save, restore, not destroy. He had sympathy with the Regent. He who knew how want of money oppresses, above all, where it leads to humiliation and scorn, sought for reasons to avoid the unpleasant duty. The Regent was old, and the head of a family that lived magnificently in neighboring provinces, where much coffee was reaped. The Dutch government has its coffee gardens. If a regent encourages labor in those gardens, or, better still, compels men and women to work for nothing in the government gardens, these government gardens will produce much coffee, and the regent receives a certain percentage, so much for every picale. And where many emoluments were enjoyed, was it not grievous for him to be so far behind his younger relatives in style of living? Moreover, he was fanatical, and thought whilst his years advanced to be able to purchase the welfare of his soul by paying for pilgrimage to Mecca, and by giving alms to prayer-singing idlers. The functionaries who had preceded Havelaar in Labec had not always shown a good example, and finally the extensiveness of the Labec family of the Regent, that lived entirely at his expense, made it very difficult for him to return to the right path. Therefore Havelaar sought for reasons to delay all severity, and to try once more, and still once more, what could be done by gentle means. And he went further still than kindness. With a generosity which reminded him of the faults that had made him so poor, he continually advanced money to the Regent, and that on his own responsibility, in order that necessity should not urge too strongly to repine; and, as was ordinarily the case, he forgot himself so far as to offer to retrench in his own family to what was strictly necessary, that he might assist the Regent with the little that he could still spare of his income. Were it still necessary to prove the gentleness with which Havelaar fulfilled his difficult duty, that proof could be found in the verbal message which he entrusted to the Controller when Verbrugge was going for a few days to Serang. "Tell the Resident that he, on hearing of the abuses that take place here, must not believe that I am indifferent on the subject, of which I do not immediately make an official report, because I would spare the Regent, for whom I feel pity, from too great severity, so I will try first to bring him to a sense of duty by gentleness." Havelaar was often out for many days together. When he was at home, he was for the most part to be found in the room which we represented in our plan as No. 7. There he was generally occupied in writing, and received the persons who asked an audience. He had chosen this spot because there he was near Tiné, who was generally in the next room; for so cordially were they bound together that Max, even when he was occupied with work that needed attention and exertion, continually wanted to see and hear her. It was often comical how he suddenly spoke to her about what came up in his thoughts about the subjects that occupied him, and how quickly she, without understanding what he treated, knew how to seize the sense of his meaning, which he did not generally explain, as if it was a matter of course that she knew what he meant. Often when he was discontented with his own labor, or bad news just received, he would jump up and say something unkind to her, who was not to blame for his discontent, but she liked to hear this, because it was another proof how Max confounded her with himself, and therefore there was never a question of repentance of such apparent unkindness, or of pardon on the other side. This would have appeared to them as if somebody had asked his own pardon because he, in ill humor, had beaten his own forehead. She knew him so well that she could tell exactly when she had to be there to procure him a moment's relaxation, exactly when he needed her advice, and not less exactly she knew when she had to leave him alone. In this room Havelaar was seated on a certain morning when the controller entered with a letter in his hand just received. "This is a difficult matter," he said, entering, "very difficult." When I state that this letter imposed on him the duty of stating to Havelaar why there was a change in the prices of joiners' work and laborers' wages, the reader will think that the controller Verbrugge saw difficulties rather too readily. I make haste, therefore, to add that many others would have thought the answer of this simple question very difficult. A few years ago a prison had been built at Rangkasbitung. Now it is generally known that the functionaries in the interior of Java understand the art of erecting buildings that are worth thousands, without spending more than so many hundreds for them. This gains them the reputation for capacity, and zeal for the service of the country. The difference between the money expended and the value of what they get for it is supplied by unpaid labor. For a few years regulations have existed which forbid this. It is not the question here whether these regulations are observed, nor if the government itself wishes them to be fulfilled with an exactness that would be burdensome on the budget of the building department. It is with this, as with other regulations that look so philanthropic on paper. Now, many buildings had to be erected at Rangkasbitung, and the engineers who were instructed to prepare plans of these had of course asked for information regarding the local rates of wages and the price of materials. Havelaar had charged the controller to prepare an exact estimate of these matters, and had recommended him to give the true prices, without looking back to what had happened before, and Verbrugge had fulfilled this duty. But these prices did not agree with the statements made a few years back. The reason of this difference was asked, and that was what Verbrugge deemed so very difficult. Havelaar, who knew very well what was concealed behind this apparently simple business, replied that he would communicate his ideas about this difficulty in writing, and I find amongst the documents before me a copy of that letter, which seems to be the consequence of this promise. If the reader should perhaps complain of this detention with a correspondence on the price of joiners' work with which he has apparently nothing to do, I must beg him to observe that the question here is properly about quite another matter, viz., the condition of the official Indian economy, and that the letter which I communicate does not only throw another ray of light on the artificial optimism of which I have spoken, but paints at the same time the difficulty with which a man like Havelaar had to struggle, who would go on straight forward. No. 114, Rangkasbitung, March 15, 1856. To the Controller of Lebak. When I sent you the letter of the Director of Public Works, dated 16th ultimo, No. 271/354, I begged you to answer the questions which that letter contained, after having consulted the Regent and duly considered what I wrote in my missive of the 5th inst. Number 97. This missive contains some hints about what may be considered right and just with regard to the fixing of the prices of materials to be supplied by the people to and at the charge of the government. This you have done in your letter of the 8th inst., number 6, and as I believe to the best of your knowledge, so that I, confiding in your local information and that of the Regent, have submitted these accounts as prepared by you to the Resident. This was followed by a missive from that chief functionary, dated the 5th inst., number 326, whereby information was required about the cause of the difference between the prices given by me and those that had been sent in 1854 and 1855, the two preceding years, for the building of a prison. I of course put this letter into your hands, and verbally required you now to justify your statements, which ought to be less difficult for you, as it enabled you to appeal to the instructions given you in my letter of the 5th inst., and of which we spoke at length more than once. Up to this point all is very plain and simple, but yesterday you entered my office with the Resident's letter in your hands, and began to speak of the difficulty of clearing up the question put therein. I perceived again some reluctance to give certain things their true names, which I have told you of before, and lately in the presence of the Resident, something which I call, for shortness' sake, halfness, and against which I often warned you in a friendly way. Halfness leads to nothing. Half is no good. Half true is untrue. For full payment, for a full rank, after a distinct complete oath, full duty must be done. If courage is sometimes necessary to fulfill that duty, one must possess that courage. For myself, I should not have the courage to lack that courage. For apart from the discontentedness with oneself, which is a consequence of neglect of duty or lukewarmness, the seeking for easier byways, the desire always and everywhere to escape collisions, to settle, produces indeed more care, more danger than is to be met with a straight policy. During the course of a very important affair which is now under the consideration of the Government, and in which you ought to be concerned in an official way, I left you tacitly, as it were, neutral, and alluded laughingly from time to time to the circumstance. When, for instance, I lately received your report about the causes of poverty and starvation among the population, and replied thereto, "All this may be the truth. It is not the whole truth, nor the cardinal truth. The principal or main cause lies deeper." You freely assented to this, and I made no use of my right to exact that you should make known that cardinal truth. For this indulgement I had many reasons, and amongst others this, that I thought it unjust to exact suddenly from you what many others in your place would have readily afforded. To force you to say farewell in such a hurry to a course of reserve and timorousness that is not your fault, but that of the training which you have received. Finally, I wish to give you first an example how much simpler and easier it is to do one's duty fully than only by halves. But now that I have had the honor of seeing you so long under my orders, and after having continually given you occasion to make yourself acquainted with principles which, unless I err, will triumph at last, I should wish that you accepted them, that you would make your own the power which is not wanting, but merely in disuse, to tell me to the best of your knowledge what you have to say, and that you would bid adieu at once and forever to that unmanly fear of telling the plain truth. I expect, therefore, a simple but complete report of what seems to you to be the cause of the difference in price between 1854 and 1856. I sincerely hope that you will not consider any phrase of this letter meant to hurt you. I trust that you understand me well enough to know that I say neither more nor less than I mean, and, moreover, I give you the assurance that my observations refer less to you than to the school in which you were trained for an Indian functionary. Yet this circonstance atténuante would disappear if you, continuing longer with me, and serving the government under my orders, should go on to follow the course against which I set myself. You may have observed that I have omitted the title Right Honorable. Note: Right Honorable is by no means a good translation of the Dutch wel edel gestrenge. It is impossible to translate this into English, just as Right Worshipful could hardly be translated into Dutch without becoming ridiculous. I have omitted the title. It annoyed me. Do the same to me, and let our honorableness, where it is necessary, come forward in another manner than by this annoying style, spoiling the use of titles. The Assistant Resident of Labec. Signed, Max Havelaar. The reply to this letter was an accusation against some of Havelaar's predecessors, and proved that he was not very wrong in quoting the bad examples of former times amongst the reasons that pleaded as an excuse for the Regent. In communicating this letter I have departed from the order of time to make it at once obvious how little help Havelaar could expect from the Controller as soon as quite different and more important transactions were to be called by their right names, when the latter, who was without doubt a good man, had to be addressed in this way about telling the truth, when the question was only to give information about the prices of wood, stone, lime, and wages, and how Havelaar had not only to struggle with the power of those who reaped advantage from crime, but likewise with the timorousness of those who, though condemning that crime as much as he, did not mean courageously to combat it. Perhaps the reader, after having perused this letter, will think no more with such disdain of the servile submission of the Javanese, who in presence of his chief revokes like a coward an accusation, however well founded it may be. For if you consider that there was so much cause for fear, even for the European functionary, who certainly may be deemed to be somewhat less exposed to vengeance, what then awaited the poor husbandman, who, in a village far from the capital, fell entirely into the power of his accused oppressors? Is it surprising that these poor men, afraid of the consequences of their boldness, endeavored to escape or to soften those consequences by humble submission? And it was not only the Controller Verbrugge who did his duty with shyness characteristic of neglect of duty. The Jaksa, likewise, the native chief who fills in the council of the country the office of public prosecutor, preferred entering in the evening, unseen and without attendance, the house of Havelaar. He whose duty it was to prevent theft, he whose vocation it was to catch the sneaking thief, sneaked softly in at the back door, as if he were himself a thief, fearing to be seized, after having firstly convinced himself that there was no company which could have afterwards betrayed him as guilty of performing his duty. Was it to be wondered at that the soul of Havelaar was very sad, and that Tine had to go more than ever to his room to console him, when she saw him sitting there with his head resting on his hand? And yet his greatest difficulty was not in the shyness of those who were near him, nor in the accessory cowardice of those who had invoked his help. No, quite alone, if necessary, he would do justice, without or with the help of others. Yes, against all, even were it against the will of those who were in want of that justice. For he knew the influence he had over the people, and how, if once the poor oppressed were summoned to repeat loudly and before the tribunal what they had whispered to him during the evening and the night in solitude, he knew how he had the power to work upon their minds, and how the force of his words would be stronger than the fear of the revenge of district chief or regent. The fear that his protege would forsake their own cause did not restrain him. It cost him so much to accuse this old regent, that was the reason of his internal struggle. But on the other hand, he ought not to yield to this reluctance, because the whole population, besides their good right, had as much claim to pity. Fear for himself had no part in his doubts. for though he knew the unwillingness with which the government generally entertains the accusation of a regent, and how much easier it is to take away the bread of the European functionary than to punish a native chief, he had a special reason to believe that exactly at this moment other than the ordinary principles would predominate in the decision of such an affair. It is true that he would have done his duty as faithfully even without this opinion, with more pleasure if he had deemed the danger for himself and his household greater than ever. We have already said how difficulty enticed him, how he thirsted for sacrifice, but he thought that the charm of a self-sacrifice did not exist here, and he feared that when at last he should have to commence a more serious struggle against injustice, he should come short of the chivalrous pleasure of having commenced this struggle as the weakest party. Yes, that was what he feared. He thought that at the head of the government was a governor-general who would be his ally, and it was another peculiarity of his character that this opinion restrained him from severe measures, and would do so longer than anything else, because it prevented his attacking injustice at a moment that he thought justice stronger than ever. I have already said, in my attempt to describe his character, that with all his sharpness he was ingenuous, naive. I will endeavor to explain how Havelaar arrived at this opinion. Few European readers can form an exact idea of the height on which a governor-general must stand as an individual, not to be beneath the dignity of his office, and it is therefore not too severe a judgment if I maintain that very few, perhaps none, have been able to respond to so heavy a claim. Not to speak of the qualities of head and heart that are required, only cast an eye on the giddy height on which so suddenly the man is placed, who, yesterday only a citizen, today has power over millions of subjects. He who a short time ago was still hidden among his acquaintances, without being more than they in rank or power, feels himself suddenly, for the most part unexpectedly, elevated above a multitude infinitely greater than the small circle in which he had been before, but imperfectly known, and I believe that I was not wrong in calling this height giddy, which, indeed, puts us in mind of the giddiness of one who sees suddenly a precipice before him, or which makes you think of the blindness that strikes us if we come suddenly from a deep darkness into bright light. Against such transitions the nerves of vision and the brain are no match, even where they are of extraordinary strength. When also the nomination to the rank of governor-general bears in itself causes of corruption, which will affect even one remarkable for excellent understanding and thorough conscientiousness, what may be expected of persons who already, before their nomination, had many faults? And if we suppose that the king is always well informed before he signs his august name at the foot of the document in which he says he is convinced of the good faith, the zeal, and the capacity of the newly appointed governor, even if we suppose that the new viceroy is zealous, faithful, and able, then the question still remains whether this zeal, and, above all, this capacity, exist within him in a measure high enough elevated above mediocrity to satisfy the claims of his vocation. For the question cannot be whether the man who for the first time leaves the king's cabinet at The Hague as governor-general possesses at that moment the capacity necessary for his new office. That is impossible. By the declaration of confidence in his capacity can only be meant the belief that he, in a quite different situation, on a given moment, shall know, as it were by intuition, what he could not have learnt at The Hague. In other words, that he is a genius which suddenly must know and understand what before it neither knew nor understood. Such geniuses are rare, even among persons who are in favor with kings. As I speak of geniuses, the reader will understand that I wish to omit what could be said of many a governor, It would likewise disgust me to insert in my book pages that should expose the serious design of this work to the suspicion of hunting after scandal. I omit, therefore, the peculiarities that can only reach certain persons, but as a general history of the malady of the situation of the Governors General, I believe that I can give: First period, dizziness, intense drunkenness, self-conceit, immoderate self-confidence, disdain of others, above all of persons who have been long in India. Second period, fatigue, fear, dejection, inclination to sleep and rest, immoderate confidence in the Council of India, homesickness, and desire for a Dutch country seat. Between these two periods, and as a sort of transition, perhaps as cause of this transition, there is dysentery. I trust that many persons in India will thank me for this diagnosis. The application is very useful, for it may be accepted as very certain that the patient, who through overexertion in the first period would choke at a gnat, would later, after the dysentery, swallow without difficulty a camel; or, to speak more plainly, that a functionary who accepts presents not with the intention of enriching himself, for instance a bundle of pisang worth a few pence, would in the first period of the malady be driven away with scorn and disgrace; but if that official has patience enough to wait for the second period, he may seize very calmly, and without any fear of punishment, the garden where the pisang grew, with the adjoining gardens, and the houses round, and what there may be in those houses, and other things ad libitum. Every one may take advantage of this pathological philosophical observation, and keep secret my advice to prevent too much competition. A curse on it, that indignation and grief are so often clothed in the rags of satire; a curse on it, that a tear, to be understood, must be accompanied with a sneer. Or is it the fault of my inexperience that I seek in vain for words to name the depth of the wound that cankers in our Indian government, without borrowing the style of Figaro or Punch? Style! Yes, there are documents before me in which there is style that showed that there was a man in the neighborhood, a man to whom it would have been worth the trouble to give a helping hand. And of what use was this style to poor Havelaar? He did not translate his tears into grins, he did not scoff, he did not endeavor to touch by a medley of colors or insipid farces. Of what use was it to him? If I could write like him I should write otherwise than he. Style? Did you hear how he spoke to the chiefs? And of what use was it to him? If I could speak like him I should speak otherwise than he. Away with conscientious language, away with considerateness, straightforwardness, plainness, simplicity, feeling; away with all that puts you in remembrance of Horace's justem et tenacem. Trumpets here, and the sharp rattle of kettledrums, whizzing of rockets, screeching of tuneless strings, here and there a true word sneaking in as contraband, under cover of so much drumming and so much trumpeting. Style? He had style. He had too much soul to drown his thoughts in. "I have the honor to be, and the right honorable, and the respectfully giving in considerations." That was the luxury of the small world in which he moved. When he wrote, something impressed you in the reading of it which made you understand that there were clouds accompanying this thunderstorm, and that you did not hear the rattling of tin thunderstorm as in a theater. When he struck fire from ideas, the heat of his fire was felt by all but born clerks or governors general, or the writer of that most disgusting report about tranquil tranquillity. And what was the use of it to him? If I want to be heard and above all understood, must I then write otherwise than he? But how, then? Do you see, reader, I look for an answer to this how, and therefore my book is such a medley. It is a pattern card. Make your choice. Afterwards I will give you yellow or blue or red, as you please. Havelaar had already so often observed the governor's malady in so many sufferers, and often in anima vili, for there are analogical residents, controllers, clerks' maladies, that are in proportion to the first as the measles to the smallpox, and finally, he himself had suffered from this malady. He had already so often observed this that he knew the symptoms very well. He had remarked that the present Governor-General Daimar van Twist had been less dizzy at the commencement of the malady than most others, and he concluded from this that the rest of the malady would likewise take another course. Therefore he feared to be the strongest if at last he should have to come forward as the champion of the rights of the inhabitants of Lebak. He would begin the campaign as the weakest, and yet at last be the strongest. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Max Havelaar by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, composed by Sterne. Havelaar received a letter from the Regent of Janjor, wherein the latter communicated to him that he wished to pay a visit to his uncle, the Regent of Lebak. This was very disagreeable news for him. He knew how the chiefs in the Pramoedya regencies were accustomed to display much magnificence, and how the Regent of Janjor could not undertake such a journey without a train of many hundreds, all of whom must be lodged and fed, as also their horses. He would gladly have prevented this visit, but he thought in vain of the means of doing so without offending the Regent of Rangkas-Beton, as the latter was very proud, and would have felt deeply offended if his comparative poverty had been mentioned as a motive for not visiting him. And if this visit could not be avoided, it would inevitably give occasion to aggravate the oppression of the people. It is to be doubted if Havelaar's speech had made a lasting impression on the chiefs. With many this was certainly not the case, but it is certain that in all the villages the report had spread that the gentleman who had power at Rangkas-Beton would do justice, and if his words were powerless to prevent crime, they had at least given the victims the courage to complain, however hesitatingly and secretly. In the evening they crept through the ravine, and when Tina was sitting in her room she was frightened by an unexpected noise, and saw before the open windows dark forms that sneaked along with a shy step. But very soon she started no more, for she knew what it meant when these forms wandered like so many spectres round the house, and asked protection of her Max. Then she beckoned him, and he got up to call in the complainants. Most of them came from the district of Parangkujang, where one of the chiefs was a son-in-law of the Regent, and though this chief did not omit to take his part of the extortion, yet it was no secret that he generally robbed in name of the Regent, and for his benefit. It was affecting to see how these poor men relied upon the chivalry of Havelaar, that he would not summon them to repeat the following day openly what they told him in his room. This would have caused an ill treatment of them all, and the death of many. Havelaar made notes of what they said, and after that ordered the plaintiffs to return to their village. He promised that justice should be done, provided they made no opposition, and did not emigrate, as was the intention of many. Generally he was shortly afterwards at the place where the injustice happened. Yes, he had often been there already, and had for the most part examined into the affair before the plaintiff himself had returned to his dwelling. In this manner he visited in this extensive department villages that were 80 miles distant from Rangkas-Beton, without the Regent or even the Controller Verbrugge knowing that he was absent from the capital. His object in so doing was to shield the complainants from the danger of revenge, and at the same time to spare the Regent the shame of a public inquiry, which with Havelaar would not have ended in a revocation of the complaint. He still hoped that the chiefs would turn back on the dangerous road which they had already walked so long, and he would in that case have been contented merely to claim indemnification for the poor sufferers. But on every occasion of his speaking to the Regent, it was evident to him that all promises of amendment were vain, and he was deeply pained at the ill success of his endeavors. We shall now leave him for a time in his disappointment and the difficult work he had undertaken, to relate to the reader the history of the Javanese Sajja in the Desabadoer. I extract from Havelaar's notes the name of this village and that of the Javanese concerned. It is a case of extortion and plunder, and lest my history should be thought fictitious, I give the assurance that I can furnish the names of the 32 persons in the district of Parangkujang alone, from whom in the course of 1 month 36 buffaloes had been stolen for the use of the Regent, or, still better, I can give the names of 32 persons in that district who in 1 month dared to complain, and whose complaints, having been examined by Havelaar, were found to be true. Note: this statement the author published in 1861 at Amsterdam. Mine brieven by Multatuli. There are 5 such districts in the Residency of Lebak. Now, if one chooses to believe that the number of stolen buffaloes was less in those parts that had not the honor of being governed by the son-in-law of the Regent, I will grant that, though the question still remains whether the rapacity of other chiefs was not founded on as sure ground as that of near relationship. For instance, the district chief of Chilankahan on the south coast could, in default of a father-in-law, of whom one was much afraid, rely upon the difficulty with which the poor in their complaints had to contend, that, namely, of walking 40 or 60 miles before hiding themselves during the evening in the ravine near Havelaar's house. And if we observe the fact that many started never to reach that house, that many did not even leave their village, frightened as they were by their own experience or by the sight of the fate which overtook other plaintiffs, then I believe that we should be wrong in thinking that the multiplication by 5 of the number of buffaloes stolen out of one district would be too high an estimate of the number of cattle stolen every month in the 5 districts to provide for the wants of the Regent of Lebak's court. And it was not buffaloes alone, nor was buffalo robbing the main thing. A somewhat less degree of shamelessness is required, above all in India, where statute labor is still lawful, to summon the people unlawfully for unpaid labor than is necessary to take away property. It is easier to make the population believe that the government wants labor without wishing to pay for it than that it should claim the poor man's buffalo for nothing, and even if the timorous Javanese dared to investigate whether the statute labor required of him agreed with the regulations on the subject, even then it would be impossible to succeed, as the one has nothing to do with the other, and he cannot therefore calculate whether the fixed number of persons has not been exceeded 10 or 50 times. Where also the most dangerous, the most easily discovered abuse is executed with such boldness, what may not then be thought of the abuses that are much easier of execution and less liable to discovery? I said that I was going to relate the history of the Javanese Sajja, yet I am compelled first to make one of those digressions which are so difficult to avoid when describing situations that are quite strange to the reader. I will state at the same time the causes that make it so difficult for those who have not been in India to judge of Indian affairs. I have repeatedly spoken of the people as Javanese, and however natural this nomenclature may appear to the European reader, It must have sounded wrong to the ears of any one acquainted with Java. The western residencies of Bantam, Batavia, Priangan, Croawant, and a part of Cirebon, all together called Sunda countries, note Sunda or Sunda, are not considered as belonging to Java proper, and not to speak now of the foreigners that came from over the sea into these regions, the aboriginal population is quite different from that of the middle of Java, or that of the so-called East Corner. Language, character of the people, manners, dress, change so much as you go eastward that, indeed, there is more difference between the Sundanese and the Javanese proper than between the English and the Dutch. Such differences are often the cause of disputes in judging of Indian affairs. If we observe that Java alone is so sharply divided into two distinct parts, without marking the many subdivisions of these, we may calculate how great the difference must be between populations that live further from each other and are separated by the sea. He whose knowledge of Dutch India is confined to Java can no more form a just idea of the Malay, the Ambionese, the Bata, the Alfoer, the Timorese, the Dayak, or the native of Macassar than he who never left Europe. And for a person who has had the opportunity of observing the difference between these populations, it is indeed often amusing to hear the conversations, and afflicting to hear the speeches of persons who get their knowledge of Indian affairs at Batavia or at Buitenzorg. I have often wondered at the courage with which, for instance, a late Governor General endeavored, in the representative chambers, to give weight to his words by a pretended claim to local knowledge and experience. I esteem very highly the knowledge acquired by profound study in the library, and have often been astonished at the extent of the knowledge of Indian affairs which some have displayed without having ever trod Indian ground, and when a late Governor General gives proofs of having acquired such knowledge in this manner, we feel for him the respect which is the legitimate reward of the conscientious and fruitful labor of many years. This respect would be still greater for him than for the scholar who had fewer difficulties to conquer, because he, at a far distance, without inspections, ran a less risk of falling into the errors which are the consequence of a defective view, as was the lot of the late Governor General. Note: because usually the Governors General have never before been in India. The late Governor General, for instance, when he was appointed by the King, had never been in India, or connected in anything with Indian matters. I said that I was surprised at the confidence which some have shown in the treatment of Indian affairs, for they know that their words are heard by others than those who think it enough to have passed a few years at Buitenzorg to know India, that these words are likewise read by those persons in India itself who were the witness of their inexperience, and who, as much as I, are astonished at the boldness with which a man, who only a short time ago tried to hide this incapacity behind the high rank which the King had given him, speaks now, all at once, as if he really possessed a knowledge of the affairs of which he treats. Again and again, therefore, you hear complaints of incompetent interference. Again and again this or that system is opposed in the representative chambers by denying the competency of him who represents such a system, and it would perhaps not be inopportune to make an exact inquiry into the qualities which make a person competent to judge of competency. Generally the touchstone of an important question is not the matter of which it treats, but the value which is ascribed to the opinion of the person who speaks of it, and as he is often one who is considered to be qualified above all others, one who had in India such a high position, the consequence of it is that the results of the voting bear generally the color of the errors that seem to stick to these important positions. If this is the case where the influence of such a person is only exercised by a member of the representative chambers, How great then will be the inclination to judge wrongly if such influence is accompanied by the confidence of the king, who placed this functionary at the head of the ministry of the colonies. It is a peculiar phenomenon, perhaps owing its origin to a sort of dullness which shuns the trouble of judging for ourselves, how easily one gives his confidence to persons who know how to give themselves the appearance of more knowledge, when this knowledge has been drawn from a foreign source. The reason, perhaps, is that self-love is less hurt by the acknowledgment of such an ascendancy than would be the case if one could have recourse to the same expedients when anything like emulation should arise. It is easy for the representative of the people to give up his opinion as soon as it is combated by a person who may be deemed to pass a more accurate judgment than he, and this accuracy need not be ascribed to personal superiority, confession of which would be more difficult, but only to the particular circumstances wherein such an opponent has been. And not to speak of those who have filled high offices in India, it is indeed strange how often value is ascribed to the opinion of persons who really possess nothing to justify the credit given them than the remembrance of a residence of so many years in those regions, and this is so much the more strange because they, who attach importance to such a source of information, would not readily believe all that would be told them, for instance, about political economy in Holland, by a person who could show that he had lived 40 or 50 years in Holland. There are persons who have lived more than 30 years in Dutch India without ever coming in contact with either the population or the native chiefs, and it is sad that the Council of India is often totally, or for a great part, composed of such persons, that the means have even been found to make the king sign the appointment as Governor-General of a person who belonged to this class. When I said that this supposed capacity of a newly appointed Governor-General might be considered as implying that he was held to be a genius, I did not mean to recommend the appointment of geniuses. Besides the difficulty of having this important employment continually vacant, another reason pleads against this. A genius would not be able to work under a minister of the colonies, and would therefore be useless, as geniuses generally are. It would perhaps be desirable that the main faults given by me in the form of a diagnosis should get the attention of those who are called upon to choice of a new governor. Taking it for granted that all the persons considered eligible are conscientious, and in the possession of a faculty of comprehension sufficient to enable them to learn a little of what they will have to know, I think it a main thing that the avoidance may be expected of them of that presumptuous self-conceit in the beginning, and, above all, of that apathetic sluggishness in the last years of their administration. I have already said that Havelaar, in his difficult duty, thought he could rely upon the help of the Governor-General, and I added that this opinion was naif. That Governor-General was expecting his successor. His rest in Holland was near. We shall see what this sluggishness brought upon Havelaar, and upon the Javanese Saija, whose monotonous history, one amongst many, I am now about to relate. Yes, monotonous it will be. Monotonous as the history of the activity of the ant, which had to carry up its contribution for the winter store over the clod, the mountain, which blocks up the way to the storehouse. Again and again it falls back with its burden, to try again to put its feet on that little stone high there on the rock at the top of the mountain. But between it and this top there is an abyss, a depth which 1,000 ants could not fill. This must be passed. Therefore the ant that has scarcely the strength to drag its burden on even ground, a burden many times heavier than its own body, that can hardly lift it up and balance itself on an unsteady footing, has to preserve its equilibrium. When it climbs with its burden between the forelegs, It has to sling it round to the side to make it come down on the point which stretches out on the rock. It staggers, totters, is frightened, sinks down, endeavors to take hold of the half rooted up trunk of a tree, of a blade of grass, which, with its top, points to the depth. It loses the fulcrum which it sought for, the tree gives way, the blade of grass yields under its weight, and the ant falls back into the depth with its burden. Then it is still for a moment, which is long in the life of an ant. It is stunned by the pain of its fall, or does it yield to grief that so much exertion was in vain? No, its courage does not forsake it. Again it seizes the burden, and again drags it aloft, again soon to fall into the depth. So monotonous is my tale. But I shall not speak of ants, whose joy or sorrow escapes our observation through the dullness of our organs. I shall speak of men who move in the way same as we do. It is true, he who shuns emotion, and would fain avoid compassion, will say that those men are yellow or brown, many call them black, and for them the difference of color is reason enough for turning the eye from their misery, or at least for looking down on it without emotion. My narrative is therefore only addressed to those who are capable of the difficult faith that hearts throb under that dark epidermis, and that he who is blessed with a white skin and the civilization thereunto belonging, generosity, mercantile knowledge, and religion, virtue, etc., might use these qualities of the white man better than has yet been experienced by those less blessed in color and mental capacity. Yet my confidence in your sympathy with the Javanese does not go so far as to make me imagine, when I tell you how the last buffalo has been carried off from the enclosure in broad daylight, without fear, under protection of Dutch power, when I cause the stolen cattle to be followed by the owner and his weeping children, and make him sit down upon the steps of the robber's house, speechless and senseless, absorbed in sorrow, to be chased away with outrage and disdain, menaced with stripes and prison. See, I neither claim nor expect that you will be moved by this in the same manner as you would be if I sketched the destiny of a Dutch peasant whose cow had been taken away. I ask no tear for the tears that flow on such dark faces, nor noble indignation when I shall speak of the despair of the sufferer. Neither do I expect that you will rise and go with my book in your hand to the king, saying, "Look here, O king, that happens in your empire, in your beautiful empire of Insulinde." No, no, all this I do not expect. The excess of misery at home overmasters your feeling of sympathy for what is far away. Was there not yesterday but little business going on at the Exchange, and does not the glutting of the coffee market threaten a reduction in price? "Don't write such nonsense to your papa, Sterne," I said, and perhaps a little passionately, for I can't bear untruth. That has always been a fixed principle with me. I wrote that evening to old Mr. Sterne, telling him to beware of false reports. The reader understands what I have again suffered in listening to the last chapters. Was I not right when I said that Shulman had made them all mad with his parcel? Would you recognize in this writing business of Sterne, and Fred too helps, that is certain, young men that were educated in a respectable house? What foolish sallies are these against a sickness which reveals itself in a desire for a country seat? Is that aimed at me? Am not I allowed to go to Drybergen as soon as Fred is a broker? And who speaks of dysentery in the company of mothers and daughters? It is a fixed principle with me always to remain quiet, for I think it useful in business. But I must confess that it has often cost me a great deal to listen to all the nonsense that Sterne reads. What does he mean? What must be the end of all this? When shall we hear anything substantial? Of what interest is it for me whether Havelaar keeps his garden clean or not? and whether those people enter in front of the house or at the back. At Busselinck and Waterman's one has to go through a small entrance near an oil warehouse, where it is always abominably dirty. And then those tiresome buffaloes. Why do they want buffaloes, those black fellows? I never had a buffalo, and yet I am contented. There are men who are always complaining. And as regards that scoffing at forced labor, I perceived that he had not heard that sermon of Domine Wabelar's, otherwise he would know how useful labor is in the extension of the kingdom of God. It is true, he is a Lutheran. To be sure, if I could have known how he would write the book, which was to be so important to all coffee brokers and others, I would rather have done it myself. But he is supported by the Rosemeyers, who trade in sugar, and this makes him so bold. I said plainly, for I am honest in those things, that we can dispense with the history of that man Saija, but just then, all at once, Louise Rosemeyer began to cry. It appears that Sterne had told her that there would be something about love in it, and girls are mad after that. Yet this would not have made me yield if the Rosemeyers had not told me that they would like to be acquainted with Sterne's father. Of course, through the father they will arrive at the uncle who trades in sugar. If I am now too much for common sense and against Sterne Jr., I get the appearance as if I would keep them away from him, and that is not at all the case, for they trade in sugar. I don't understand what Sterne means by what he writes. There are always discontented people, and does it become him who enjoys so much good in Holland, only this week my wife gave him chamomile tea, to scoff at the government? Does he mean to excite public discontent? Does he want to become Governor-General? He is self-conceited enough for that. I told him the other day that he spoke very bad Dutch. "Oh, that is nothing," said he. "It seems that a governor is very seldom sent over who understands the language of the country." What shall I do with such a self-conceited fellow? He has not the least respect for my experience. When I told him this week that I had been a broker for 17 years, he cited Busselinck and Waterman, who have been brokers for 18 years, and, said he, "They have 1 year's more experience." Thus he caught me, for I must confess, because I like truth, that Busselinck and Waterman have little knowledge of business, and that they are old women and sneaks. Mary, too, is led astray. Only this week it was her turn to read at breakfast. We were about to have the history of Lot, when she suddenly stopped and refused to proceed. My wife, who likes religion as much as I do, tried gently to persuade her to obedience, because it does not become a modest girl to be so obstinate. All in vain. Thereupon I, as a father, was obliged to scold her with much severity, because she spoiled by her obstinacy the comfort of the breakfast, which always has a bad influence on the whole day. But nothing would help, and she went so far as to say that she would rather be beaten till she was dead than proceed with reading. I have punished her with 3 days' confinement to her room on coffee and bread. I hope that it will do her good. To make this punishment severe, at the same time a moral lesson, I have ordered her to copy the chapter which she would not read 10 times, and I have treated her with this severity above all because I have perceived that she has, during the last few days, whether from Sterne or not I do not know, taken up ideas which appear to me to be dangerous to morality, to which my wife and I are so much attached. I heard her sing, for instance, a French song, by Béranger, I believe, in which the poet pities a poor old beggar who in her youth sung at a theater, and yesterday at breakfast she had no stays on. Mary, I mean, that was really not respectable. I have likewise to confess that Fred brought home little good from the prayer meeting. I had been much pleased with his sitting so quietly in church. He did not move, and always looked at the pulpit, but afterwards I heard that Betsy Rosemeyer was sitting near it. I said nothing about it, for one must not be too severe towards young people, and the Rosemeyers are a respectable firm. They have given their eldest daughter, who married Brueggemann, the druggist, something very nice, and therefore I believe that this will keep Fred away from the Westermarket, which is very gratifying to me, because I am so attached to morality. But I am grieved to see that this does not prevent Fred from hardening his heart like Pharaoh, who was less guilty, because he had no father to show him continually the right path, for the Scriptures do not speak of old Pharaoh. Domine Wawelaar complains of his conceit, I mean Fred's, at catechism, and he seems, again from Schalman's parcel, to have derived this self-conceit which drives the conscientious Wawelaar almost mad. It is touching how the worthy man who often lunches with us endeavors to work on Fred's feelings, and how the scamp is always ready with new questions which show the perversity of his heart. It all comes from that accursed book of Schalman's. With tears of emotion on his cheeks, the zealous servant of the gospel endeavors to move him to turn away the eyes from the wisdom of men, to be introduced into the mysteries of the wisdom of God. With gentleness and meekness he prays him not to throw away the bread of eternal life, and to fall, while acting thus, into the clutches of Satan, who, with his angels, inhabits the fire prepared for him to all eternity. "Oh," said he yesterday, Wawelaar I mean, "oh, my young friend, open now eyes and ears, and hear and see what the Lord gives you to see and hear by my mouth. Pay attention to the evidences of the saints who have died for the true faith. Look at Stephen sinking down under the stones that crush him. See how he still looks to heaven, and how he ceases not to sing psalms." "I would rather have thrown stones in return," said Fred in reply. Reader, what shall I do with this fellow? A moment afterwards Wawelaar commenced again, for he is an ardent servant, and sticks to his work. "Oh," said he, "young friend," the preamble was as above, "can you remain insensible when you think of what shall become of you when once you are counted amongst the goats on the left hand?" Thereupon the rogue burst out laughing, I mean Fred, and Mary laughed too. I even thought that I perceived something like a laugh on my wife's face. But then I helped Wawelaar. I punished Fred with a fine out of his money box to the Missionary Society. But all this touches me deeply, and could any one take pleasure in hearing stories about buffaloes and the Javanese with such grievances of his own? What is a buffalo to the salvation of Fred? What do I care about the affairs of those people away there, when I have to fear that Fred will spoil my business by his unbelief, and that he will never become a good broker? For W. himself has said that God so directs all things that orthodoxy leads to wealth. Look only, he said, is there not much wealth in Holland? That is because of the faith. Is there not in France every day murder and homicide? That is because there are Roman Catholics there. Are not the Javanese poor? They are pagans. The more the Dutch have to do with the Javanese, the more wealth will be here and the more poverty there. I am astonished at Wawelaar's penetration, for it is the truth that I, who am exact in religion, see that my business increases every year, and Busselink and Waterman, who do not care about God or the commandments, will remain bunglers as long as they live. The Rosemeyers, too, who trade in sugar and have a Roman Catholic maidservant, had a short time ago to accept 27 per cent. Out of the estate of a Jew who became bankrupt. The more I reflect, the further I advance in tracing the unsearchable ways of God. Lately it appeared that 30 millions had been gained on the sale of products furnished by the pagans, and in this is not included what I have gained thereby, and others who live by this business. Is not that as if the Lord said, Here you have 30 millions as a reward for your faith? Is not that the finger of God, who causes the wicked one to labor to preserve the righteous one? Is not that a hint for us to go on in the right way, and to cause those far away to produce much, and to stand fast here to the true religion? Is it not therefore pray and labor, that we should pray, and have the work done by those who do not know the Lord's Prayer? Oh, how truly Havelaar speaks when he calls the yoke of God light! How easy the burden is to every one who believes! I am only a few years past 40, and can retire when I please to Zweibrücken, and see how it ends with others who forsake the Lord. Yesterday I saw Scholman with his wife and their little boy. They looked like ghosts. He is pale as death, his eyes protrude, and his cheeks look hollow. His attitude is bent, though he is younger than I am. She, too, was dressed very poorly, and she seemed to have been weeping again. I perceived immediately that she is of a discontented temper. I need only see a person once to form an opinion. That comes from my experience. She had on a thin cloak of black silk, and yet it was very cold. There was no trace of a crinoline. Her thin dress hung loose round the knees, and a fringe hung from the edge. He had not even his shawl, and looked as if it was summer. Yet he seems to possess a kind of pride, for he gave something to a poor woman sitting on a bridge. He who has himself so little sins if he gives anything to another. Moreover, I never give in the streets. That is a principle of mine, for I always say, when I see such poor people, perhaps it is their own fault, and I must not encourage them in their wickedness. Every Sunday I give twice, once for the poor and once for the church. So it is right. I do not know if Scholman saw me, but I passed rapidly and looked upwards, and thought of the justice of God, who would not have allowed him to walk along without an overcoat if he had behaved better, and if he were not idle, self-conceited, and sickly. As regards my book, I must indeed beg pardon of the reader on account of the unpardonable manner in which Sterne abuses our contract. I must confess that I look forward without pleasure to our next party, and the love story of this Saija. The reader knows already the sound notions which I have about love. Think only of my criticism of that excursion to the Ganges. That young ladies take pleasure in such things I understand, but that men of years hear such nonsense without disgust is inexplicable to me. I will endeavor to hear nothing of this Saija, and hope that the fellow will marry soon, if he is to be the hero of a love story. It was very good of Sterne to warn us that it will be a monotonous story. When he afterwards commences with something else, I will listen again. But I am tired almost as much of his always condemning the government as of his love stories. It may be seen from everything that Sterne is young and has little experience. To judge rightly of affairs one must see them clearly. When I married I went to The Hague and visited the museum with my wife. I there came in contact with persons in all sorts of positions in society, for I saw the Minister of Finance pass by, and we bought flannel together in Veen Street, I and my wife, I mean, and nowhere did I perceive the slightest evidence of discontent against the government. The young woman in the shop looked healthy and contented, and when, in 1856, some tried to deceive us by saying that at The Hague all was not as it ought to be, I said at the party what I thought about the discontent, and I was believed, for everyone knew that I spoke from experience. When returning from my journey the conductor of the diligence played a gay popular melody, and he would not have done that if there had been so much wrong. So, having paid attention to all, I knew immediately what to think of all that grumbling in 1856. Opposite to us there lived a young woman whose cousin has a toko in the East Indies, as they call a shop there. If all was so very bad as Sterne represents, she would likewise know something about it, and yet it seems that she is very contented, for I never hear her complain. On the contrary, she says that her cousin lives there at a country seat, and that he is a member of the consistory, and that he has sent her a cigar case ornamented with peacock's feathers, which he had himself made of bamboo. All this shows distinctly how unfounded all these complaints about misgovernment are. Likewise, it is clear that for a person who will behave properly there is still something to gain in that country, and that when this Shawlman was there he was idle, conceited, and sickly, otherwise he would not have come home so very poor to walk about here without a greatcoat. And the cousin of the young woman who lives opposite us is not the only one who has made his fortune in the East Indies. In the club I see so many persons who have been there, and who are very nicely dressed. But it is plain one must pay attention to one's business yonder as well as here. In Java pigeons will not fly into anybody's mouth ready roasted. There must be work, and whoever will not work is poor, and remains so as a matter of course. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Max Havelaar by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Continuation of Sterne's composition. Saidja's father had a buffalo with which he plowed his field. When this buffalo was taken away from him by the district chief at Parang Kujang, he was very dejected, and did not speak a word for many a day. For the time for plowing was come, and he had to fear that if the sawa (rice field) was not worked in time, the opportunity to sow would be lost, and lastly, that there would be no paddy to cut, none to keep in the lombong storeroom of the house. I have here to tell readers who know Java, but not Bantam, that in that residency there is personal landed property, which is not the case elsewhere. Saidja's father, then, was very uneasy. He feared that his wife would have no rice, nor Saidja himself, who was still a child, nor his little brothers and sisters, and the district chief, too, would accuse him to the assistant resident if he was behindhand in the payment of his land taxes, for this is punished by the law. Saidja's father then took a kris (a poniard), which was pusaka (inheritance). Such a pusaka is kept as a holy keepsake, a family heirloom, from his father. The kris was not very handsome, but there were silver bands round the sheath, and at the end there was a silver plate. He sold this kris to a Chinaman who dwelt in the capital, and came home with 24 guilders, for which money he bought another buffalo. Saidja, who was then about 7 years old, soon made friends with the new buffalo. It is not without meaning that I say made friends, for it is indeed touching to see how the carbo (buffalo) is attached to the little boy who watches over and feeds him. Of this attachment I shall very soon give an example. The large, strong animal bends his heavy head to the right, to the left, or downwards, just as the pressure of the child's finger, which he knows and understands, directs. Such a friendship little Saidja had soon been able to make with the newcomer, and it seemed as if the encouraging voice of the child gave still more strength to the heavy shoulders of the strong animal when it tore open the stiff clay and traced its way in deep, sharp furrows. The buffalo turned willingly on reaching the end of the field, and did not lose an inch of ground when plowing backwards the new furrow, which was ever nearer the old, as if the sawa was a garden ground raked by a giant. Quite near were the sawas of the father of Adinda, the father of the child that was to marry Saidja, and when the little brothers of Adinda came to the limit of their fields just at the same time that the father of Saija was there with his plow, then the children called out merrily to each other, and each praised the strength and the docility of his buffalo. But I believe that the buffalo of Saija was the best of all, perhaps because its master knew better than any one else how to speak to the animal, and buffaloes are very sensible to kind words. Saija was 9 and Adinda 6 when this buffalo was taken from the father of Saija by the chief of the district of Parangkujang. Saija's father, who was very poor, thereupon sold to a Chinaman 2 silver klambu (curtain) hooks (pusaka from the parents of his wife) for 18 guilders, and for that money bought a new buffalo. But Saija was very dejected, for he knew from Adinda's little brothers that the other buffalo had been driven to the capital, and he had asked his father if he had not seen the animal when he was there to sell the hooks of the klambu. To this question Saija's father refused to give an answer. Therefore he feared that his buffalo had been slaughtered, as the other buffaloes which the district chief had taken from the people. And Saija wept much when he thought of this poor buffalo, which he had known for such a long time, and he could not eat for many days, for his throat was too narrow when he swallowed. It must be taken into consideration that Saija was a child. The new buffalo soon got acquainted with Saija, and very soon obtained in the heart of Saija the same place as his predecessor. Alas, too soon, for the wax impressions of the heart are very soon smoothed to make room for other writing. However this may be, the new buffalo was not so strong as the former. True, the old yoke was too large for his neck, but the poor animal was willing, like his predecessor, which had been slaughtered. And though Saija could boast no more of the strength of his buffalo when he met Adinda's brothers at the boundaries, yet he maintained that no other surpassed his in willingness, and if the furrow was not so straight as before, or if lumps of earth had been turned but not cut, he willingly made this right as much as he could with his pajol (spade). Moreover, no buffalo had an oyseran like his. The Penghulu (village priest) himself had said that there was an ontong (gain, good luck) in the course of the hair whorls on its shoulders. Once, when they were in the field, Saija called in vain to his buffalo to make haste. The animal did not move. Saija grew angry at this unusual refractoriness, and could not refrain from scolding. He said, S. Everyone who has been in India will understand me, and he who does not understand me gains by it if I spare him the explanation of a coarse expression. Yet Saija did not mean anything bad. He only said it because he had often heard it said by others when they were dissatisfied with their buffaloes. But it was useless. His buffalo did not move an inch. He shook his head, as if to throw off the yoke. The breath appeared out of his nostrils. He blew, trembled. There was anguish in his blue eye, and the upper lip was curled upwards, so that the gums were bare. "Fly, fly!" Adinda's brothers cried. "Fly, Saija! There is a tiger!" And they all unyoked the buffaloes, and throwing themselves on their broad backs, galloped away through Sawa's galangangs (a trench for irrigating the rice fields), mud, brushwood, forest, and alang-alang (imperata cylindrica), along fields and roads, and when they tore panting and dripping with perspiration into the village of Bador, Saija was not with them. For when he had freed his buffalo from the yoke, and had mounted him as the others had done to fly, an unexpected jump made him lose his seat and fall to the earth. The tiger was very near. Saija's buffalo, driven on by his own speed, jumped a few paces past the spot where his little master awaited death. But through his speed alone, and not of his own will, the animal had gone further than Saija, For scarcely had it conquered the momentum which rules all matter, even after the cause has ceased, when it returned, and placing its big body, supported by its big feet, like a roof over the child, turned its horned head towards the tiger, which bounded forward, but for the last time. The buffalo caught him on his horns, and only lost some flesh, which the tiger took out of his neck. The tiger lay there with his belly torn open, and Saija was saved. Certainly there had been ontong in the oiseran of the buffalo. When this buffalo had also been taken away from Saija's father and slaughtered. I told you, reader, that my story is monotonous. When this buffalo was slaughtered, Saija was just 12, and Adinda was wearing sarongs and making figures on them. Note: Adinda had already learned to express thoughts on her tissue. She drew sad pictures on her tissue. She had already learned to express thoughts in melancholy drawings on her tissue, for she had seen Saija very sad, and Saija's father was also sad, but his mother still more so, for she had cured the wound in the neck of the faithful animal which had brought her child home unhurt, after having thought by the news of Adinda's brothers that it had been taken away by the tiger. As often as she saw this wound she thought how far the claws of the tiger, which had entered so deeply into the coarse flesh of the buffalo, would have penetrated into the tender body of her child. And every time she put fresh dressings on the wound she caressed the buffalo and spoke kindly to him, that the good faithful animal might know how grateful a mother is. Afterwards she hoped that the buffalo understood her, for then he must have understood why she wept when he was taken away to be slaughtered, and he would have known that it was not the mother of Saija who caused him to be slaughtered. Some days afterwards Saija's father fled out of the country, for he was much afraid of being punished for not paying his land taxes, and he had not another heirloom to sell, that he might buy a new buffalo, because his parents had always lived in Parang Kujang, and had therefore left him but few things. The parents of his wife, too, lived in the same district. However, he went on for some years after the loss of his last buffalo by working with hired animals for plowing, but that is a very ungrateful labor, and, moreover, sad for a person who has had buffaloes of his own. Saija's mother died of grief, and then it was that his father, in a moment of dejection, fled from Bantan, in order to endeavor to get labor in the Buitenzorg districts. But he was punished with stripes because he had left Lebak without a passport, and was brought back by the police to Bador. There he was put in prison because he was supposed to be mad, which I can readily believe, and because it was feared that he would run amuck. Note: a man who runs amuck kills everybody whom he meets, till he is at last killed himself like a mad dog. In a moment of mataglap. Note: literally, darkened eye, darkness, frenzy. This is the name one gives to the peculiar state wherein a Javanese is when, because of jealousy or oppression, he soon becomes so mad as to run amuck. But he was not long in prison, for he died soon afterwards. What became of the brothers and sisters of Saija I do not know. The house in which they lived in Bador was empty for some time and soon fell down, for it was only built of bamboo and covered with atap. Note: a sort of cane. A little dust and dirt covered the place where there had been much suffering. There are many such places in Lebak. Saija was already 15 years of age when his father set out for Buitenzorg, and he did not accompany him thither, because he had other plans in view. He had been told that there were at Batavia many gentlemen who drove in bendies, note: a sort of carriage, and that it would be easy for him to get a post as bendi boy, for which generally a young person is chosen, so as not to disturb the equilibrium of the two-wheeled carriage by too much weight behind. He would, they told him, gain much in that way, if he behaved well. Perhaps he would be able to spare in 3 years money enough to buy 2 buffaloes. This was a smiling prospect for him. With the proud step of one who has conceived a grand idea, he, after his father's flight, entered Adinda's house and communicated to her his plan. "Think of it," said he. "When I come back we shall be old enough to marry, and shall possess 2 buffaloes." "Very well, Saija, I will gladly marry you when you return. I will spin and weave sarongs and slendangs, and be very diligent all the time." "Oh, I believe you, Adinda, but if I find you married?" "Saija, you know very well that I shall marry nobody but you. My father promised me to your father." "And you yourself?" "I shall marry you. You may be sure of that. When I come back I will call from afar off. Who shall hear it, if we are stamping rice in the village?" "That is true. But Adinda oh, yes, this is better. Wait for me under the jati. Quercus indicus, Indian oak. Jati wood, under the ketapan, an Indian tree, where you gave me the melati, a beautiful flower." "But, Saija, how can I know when I am to go to the ketapan?" Saija considered and said, "Count the moons. I shall stay away 3 times 12 moons, this moon not included. See, Adinda, at every new moon cut a notch in your rice block. When you have cut 3 times 12 lines I will be under the ketapan the next day. Do you promise to be there?" "Yes, Saija, I will be there under the ketapan, near the jati wood, when you come back." Hereupon Saija tore a piece off his blue turban, which was very much worn, and gave the piece of linen to Adinda to keep it as a pledge, and then he left her and Badour. He walked many days. He passed Rangkas Betong, which was not then the capital of Lebak, and Warong Gunung, where was the house of the assistant resident, and the following day saw Pamarangkang, which lies as in a garden. The next day he arrived at Sarang, and was astonished at the magnificence and size of the place, and the number of stone houses covered with red tiles. Saija had never before seen such a thing. He remained there a day because he was tired, but during the night in the coolness he went further, and the following day, before the shadow had descended to his lips, though he wore the large tundung which his father had left him, he arrived at Tangerang. At Tangerang he bathed in the river near the passage, and rested in the house of an acquaintance of his father's, who showed him how to make straw hats like those that come from Manila. He stayed there a day to learn that, because he thought to be able to get something by that afterwards, if he should perhaps not succeed at Batavia. The following day, towards the evening, when it was cool, he thanked his host very much and went on. As soon as it was quite dark, when nobody could see it, he brought forth the leaf in which he kept the melati which Adinda had given him under the ketapan tree, for he was sad because he should not see her for so long a time. The first day, and the second day likewise, he had not felt so much how lonely he was, because his soul was quite captivated by the grand idea of gaining money enough to buy 2 buffaloes, and his father had never possessed more than one, and his thoughts were too much concentrated in the hope of seeing Adinda again to make room for much grief at his leave-taking. He took that leaf in anxious hope, and mingled the memory of it in his thoughts with the prospect of again seeing Adinda at last under the ketapan. For this prospect so occupied his heart that he, on leaving Badour and passing that tree, felt something like joy, as if the 36 moons were already past that separated him from that moment. It had appeared to him as if he had only to turn around, as if on his return from the journey, to see Adinda waiting for him under the tree. But the further he went away from Badour, the more attention he paid to the duration of one day, the longer he thought the period of the 36 moons before him. There was something in his soul which made him walk less quickly. He felt affliction in his knees, and though it was not dejection that overcame him, yet it was mournfulness, which is not far from it. He thought of returning, but what would Adinda think of so little heart? Therefore he walked on, though less rapidly than the first day. He had the Melati in his hand, and often pressed it to his breast. He had become much older during the last 3 days, and he no longer understood how he had lived so calmly before, when Adinda was so near him, and he could see her as often as he liked. But now he could not be calm when he expected that he should see her again by and by. Nor did he understand why he, after taking leave, had not returned once more to look at her again. And he even remembered how a short time ago he had quarreled with her about the cord which she had made for the lalayang, kite, a game wherein they try to cut each other's cord. Often matches take place between different villages. This is a national game in Java, like cricket in England. The lalayang of her brother, and which had broken because there was a defect in her work, by which a wager had been lost against the children of Chiporot. How was it possible, he thought, to have been angry about that with Adinda? For if there was a defect in the cord, and if the wager of Badur against Chiporot had been lost in consequence, and not by the piece of glass which little Jamyen had thrown while hiding himself behind the pagar, an enclosure constructed of bamboo canes, ought I then to have been so rough to her and called her by unseemly names? What if I die at Batavia without having asked her pardon for such harshness? Will it not make me appear as if I were a bad man who scolds a girl? And when it is heard that I have died in a foreign country, will not every one at Badur say, "It is good that Saija died, for he had an insolent mouth against Adinda"? Thus his thoughts took a course which differed much from their former buoyancy, and involuntarily were uttered, first in half words and softly, soon in a monologue, and at last in the melancholy song of which a translation follows. My first intention was to have recourse to measure and rhyme in this translation, but, like Havelaar, I thought it better to leave it without the corset. I do not know where I shall die. I saw the great sea on the south coast when I was there with my father making salt. This means to do something against the law. Salt is a monopoly of the government. The Javanese is obliged to buy from the magazines of the government. Saija, in his simplicity, is saying something which the police ought not to hear. If I die at sea and my body is thrown into the deep water, then sharks will come, and they will swim round my corpse and ask, "Which of us shall devour the body that goes down into the water?" I shall not hear it. I do not know where I shall die. I saw in a blaze the house of Paanzo, which he himself had set on fire because he was Mataglap. If I die in a burning house, glowing embers will fall on my corpse, and outside the house there will be many cries of men throwing water on the fire to kill it. I shall not hear it. I do not know where I shall die. I saw the little Si Oina fall out of a klapa tree when he plucked a klapa coconut for his mother. If I fall out of a klapa tree, I shall lie dead below in the shrubs, like Si Oina. Then my mother will not weep, for she is dead, but others will say with a loud voice, "See, there lies Saija." I shall not hear it. I do not know where I shall die. I have seen the corpse of Pa Liso, who died of old age, for his hairs were white. If I die of old age with white hairs, hired women will stand weeping near my corpse, and they will make lamentation, as did the mourners over Pa Liso's corpse, and the grandchildren will weep very loud. I shall not hear it. I do not know where I shall die. I have seen at Badur many that were dead. They were dressed in white shrouds and were buried in the earth. If I die at Badur and I am buried beyond the Desa, Javanese village, eastward against the hill where the grass is high, then will Adinda pass by there, and the border of her sarong will sweep softly along the grass. I shall hear it. Saija arrived at Batavia. He begged a gentleman to take him into his service, which this gentleman did, because he did not understand Saija's language (Sundanese), for they like to have servants at Batavia who do not speak Malay, and are, therefore, not so corrupted as others who have been longer in the connection with Europeans. Saija soon learned Malay, but behaved well, for he always thought of the 2 buffaloes which he should buy, and of Adinda. He became tall and strong, because he ate every day what could not always be had at Badur. He was liked in the stable, and would certainly not have been rejected if he had asked the hand of the coachman's daughter. His master even liked Saija so much that he soon promoted him to be an indoor servant, increased his wages, and continually made him presents, to show that he was well pleased with his services. Saija's mistress had read Sue's novel, Le Juif Errant, which for a short time was so popular. She always thought of Prince Jalma when she saw Saija, and the young girls, too, understood better than before how the Javanese painter Radin Saleh had met with such great success at Paris. But they thought Saija ungrateful when he, after almost 3 years of service, asked for his dismissal and a certificate that he had always behaved well. This could not be refused, and Saija went on his journey with a joyful heart. He passed Pisang, where Havelaar once lived many years ago. But Saija did not know this, and even if he had known it, he had something else in his soul which occupied him. He counted the treasures which he was carrying home. In a roll of bamboo he had his passport and a certificate of good conduct. In a case, which was fastened to a leathern girdle, something heavy seemed to sling continually against his shoulder, but he liked to feel that, and no wonder. This contained 30 piastres, 64 guilders, enough to buy 3 buffaloes. What would Adinda say? And this was not all. On his back could be seen the silver-covered sheath of the kris. The Javanese is never without his poniard. It belongs to his dress, which he wore in the girdle. The hilt was certainly very fine, for he had wound it round with a silk wrapper, and he had still more treasures. In the folds of the kahin, a piece of linen, round his loins, he kept a belt of silver links, with gold ikat pendieng. Pendieng is a girdle of small plates of silver or gold, and ikat pendieng the clasp of it, agraf. It is true that the belt was short, but he was so slender, Adinda. And suspended by a cord round his neck under his bajo, clothes, he wore a small silk bag, in which were some withered leaves of the melati. Was it a wonder that he stopped no longer at Sangarang than was necessary to visit the acquaintances of his father who made such fine straw hats? Was it a wonder that he said little to the girls on his road, who asked him where he came from and where he was going, the common salutation in those regions? Was it a wonder that he no longer thought Serang so beautiful, he who had learned to know Batavia? That he hid himself no more behind the pagar, as he did 3 years ago, when he saw the resident riding out, for he had seen the much grander lord who lives at Buitenzorg, and who is the grandfather of the Suhunan, Emperor of Solo, a superstition of the Javanese. Was it a wonder that he did not pay much attention to the tales of those who went in a part of the way with him, and spoke of the news of Bantan Kidul, how the coffee culture had been quite suspended after much unrewarded labor, how the district chief of Parang Gujang, who had been condemned to 14 days' arrest at the house of his father-in-law for highway robbery, how the capital had been removed to Rangkas Betong, how a new assistant resident was there, because the other had died some months ago, how this new functionary had spoken at the first Seba meeting, how for some time nobody had been punished for complaining, how the people hoped that all that had been stolen would be returned or paid for. No, he had sublime visions before his mind's eye. He sought for the ketapan tree in the clouds, as he was still too far off to seek it at Badur. He caught at the air which surrounded him, as if he would embrace the form which was to meet him under that tree. He pictured to himself the face of Adinda, her head, her shoulders. He saw the heavy conde, Signo, so black and glossy, confined in a net hanging down her neck. He saw her large eye glistening in dark reflection, the nostrils which she raised so proudly as a child when he how was it possible vexed her, and the corner of her lips, where she preserved a smile. He saw her breast, which would now swell under the kabai (Indian dress). He saw how well the sarong of her own making fitted her hips, and descending along the thighs in a curve, fell in graceful folds on the small foot. No, he heard little of what was told him. He heard quite different tones. He heard how Adinda would say, "Welcome, Saija. I have thought of you in spinning and weaving, and stamping the rice on the floor, which bears 3 times 12 lines made by my hand. Here I am under the ketapan the first day of the new moon. Welcome, Saija. I will be your wife." That was the music which resounded in his ears, and prevented him from listening to all the news that was told him on the road. At last he saw the ketapan, or rather he saw a large dark spot, which many stars covered, before his eye. That must be the wood of Jati, near the tree where he should see again Adinda next morning after sunrise. He sought in the dark, and felt many trunks, soon found the well-known roughness on the south side of a tree, and thrust his finger into a hole which Si Pante had cut with his parang an implement used by farmers in cutting grass and wood, to exorcise the Pontianak evil spirit, who was the cause of his mother's toothache a short time before the birth of Pante's little brother. That was the ketapan he looked for. Yes, this was indeed the spot where he had looked upon Adinda for the first time with quite a different eye from his other companions in play, because she had for the first time refused to take part in a game which she had played with other children, boys and girls, only a short time before. There she had given him the melati. He sat down at the foot of the tree and looked at the stars, and when he saw a shooting star he accepted it as a welcome of his return to Badur, and he thought whether Adinda would now be asleep, and whether she had rightly cut the moons on her rice floor. It would be such a grief to him if she had omitted a moon, as if 36 were not enough. And he wondered whether she had made nice sarongs and slendangs. And he asked himself, too, who would now be dwelling in her father's house. And he thought of his youth, and of his mother, and how that buffalo had saved him from the tiger, and he thought of what would have become of Adinda if that buffalo had been less faithful. He paid much attention to the sinking of the stars in the west, and as each star disappeared in the horizon he calculated how much nearer the sun was to his rising in the east, and how much nearer he himself was to seeing Adinda, for she would certainly come at the first beam. Yes, at daybreak she would be there. Ah, why had not she already come the day before? It pained him that she had not anticipated the supreme moment which had lighted up his soul for 3 years with inexpressible brightness, and, unjust as he was in the selfishness of his love, it appeared to him that Adinda ought to have been there waiting for him, who complained before the time appointed that he had to wait for her. And he complained unjustly, for neither had the sun risen, nor had the eye of day cast a glance on the plain. The stars, it is true, were growing pale up there, ashamed as they were of the approaching end of their rule. Strange colors were flowing over the tops of the mountains, which appeared darker as they contrasted sharply with places more brightly illuminated. Here and there flowed something glowing in the east, arrows of gold and of fire that were shot hither and thither, parallel to the horizon. But they disappeared again, and seemed to fall down behind the impenetrable curtain which hid the day from the eyes of Saija. Yet it grew lighter and lighter around him. He now saw the landscape, and could already distinguish a part of the klapa wood behind which Badoer lay. There Adinda slept. No, surely she did not sleep. How could she sleep? Did she not know that Saija would be awaiting her? She had not slept the whole night, certainly. The night police of the village had knocked at her door to ask why the pelitat (Javanese lamp) continued burning in her cottage, and with a sweet laugh she had said that a vow kept her awake to weave the slendang in which she was occupied, and which must be ready before the first day of the new moon. Or she had passed the night in darkness, sitting on the rice floor and counting with her eager finger that indeed 36 deep lines were cut near each other, and she had amused herself with an imaginary fright as to whether she had miscalculated, perhaps had counted less, to enjoy again and again, and every time, the delicious assurance that without fail 3 times 12 moons had passed since Saija saw her for the last time. And now that it was becoming light she, too, would be exerting herself with useless trouble to bend her looks over the horizon to meet the sun, the lazy sun that stayed away, stayed away. There came a line of bluish red which touched the clouds and made the edges light and glowing. And it began to lighten, and again arrows of fire shot through the atmosphere. But this time they did not disappear. They seized upon the dark ground, and communicated their blaze in larger and larger circles, meeting, crossing, unrolling, turning, wandering, and uniting in patches of fire and lightnings of gold luster on the azure ground. There was red and blue and silver and purple and yellow and gold in all this. Oh, God, that was the daybreak, that was seeing Adinda again. Saija had not learned to pray, and it would have been a pity to teach him, for a more holy prayer, more fervent thanksgiving than was in the mute rapture of his soul, could not be conceived in human language. He would not go to Badoer to see Adinda in reality seeming to him less pleasurable than the expectation of seeing her again. He sat down at the foot of the Ketapan, and his eyes wandered over the scenery. Nature smiled at him, and seemed to welcome him as a mother welcoming the return of her child, and as she pictures her joy by voluntary remembrance of past grief when showing what she has preserved as a keepsake during his absence. So Saija was delighted to see again so many spots that were witnesses of his short life. But his eyes or his thoughts might wander as they pleased, yet his looks and longings always reverted to the path which leads from Badoer to the Ketapan tree. All that his senses could observe was called Adinda. He saw the abyss to the left, where the earth is so yellow, where once a young buffalo sank down into the depth. They had descended with strong rattan cords, and Adinda's father had been the bravest. Oh, how she clapped her hands, Adinda! And there, further on the other side, where the wood of cocoa trees waved over the cottages of the village, there somewhere Sioina had fallen out of a tree and died. How his mother cried! Because Sioina was still such a little one, she lamented, as if she would have been less grieved if Sioina had been taller. But he was small, that is true, for he was smaller and more fragile than Adinda. Nobody walked upon the little road which leads from Badoer to the tree. By and by she would come. It was yet very early. Saija saw a bajin squirrel spring with playful nimbleness up the tree of a cocoa tree. The graceful animal, the terror of the proprietor of the tree, but still lovely in form and movement, ran untiringly up and down. Saija saw it and forced himself to stay and look at it, because this calmed his thoughts after their heavy labor since sunrise, rest after the fatiguing expectancy. Soon he uttered his impressions in words, and sang what his soul dictated him. I would rather read you his lay in Malay, that Italian language of the East. See how the bajing looks for his means of living on the klapa tree. He ascends, descends, wantons right and left. He turns round the tree, springs, falls, climbs, and falls again. He has no wings, and yet he is as quick as a bird. Much happiness, my bajing, I give you hail. You will surely find the means of living which you seek. But I am sitting alone near the wood of jati trees, waiting for the food of my heart. Long has the small appetite of my bajing been sated. Long has he returned to his little nest. But still my soul and my heart are very sad. Adinda. Still there was nobody on the path leading from Badoer to the Kitapan. Saija caught sight of a butterfly which seemed to enjoy itself in the increasing warmth. See how the butterfly flutters everywhere. His wings glisten like a flower of many colors. His heart is in love with the blossoms of the kenari. Note: a beautiful tree, the kenari produces a nut of which very good oil is made. Certainly he looks for his fragrant sweetheart. Much joy, my butterfly, I give you hail. You will surely find what you seek. But I am sitting alone near the jati wood, waiting for what my heart loves. Long since has the butterfly kissed the kenari blossom which it loves so well. But still my soul and my heart are very sad. Adinda. And still there was no one on the path leading from Badoer to the Kitapan. The sun begins to rise. There was warmth in the air. See how the sun glitters on high, high above the waringi. Note: one of the most beautiful trees in Java, the Waringi Hill. He feels too warm and wishes to descend, to sleep in the sea as in the arms of a spouse. Much joy, O sun, I give you hail. What you seek you will surely find. But I sit alone by the jati wood, waiting for the rest of my heart. Long the sun will have set, and will sleep in the sea, when all is dark, and still my soul and my heart will be very sad. Adinda. And there was nobody on the road leading from Badoer to the Kitapan. When no longer butterflies shall flutter about, when the stars shall no longer glitter, when the melati shall no longer yield its perfume, when there shall be no longer sad hearts, nor wild animals in the wood, when the sun shall go wrong and the moon forget the east and the west, if Adinda has not yet arrived, then an angel with shining wings will descend on earth to look for what remained behind. Then my corpse shall be here under the Kitapan. My soul is very sad. Adinda. There was nobody on the path leading from Badoer to the Kitapan. Then my corpse will be seen by the angel. He will point it out with his finger to his brethren. See, a dead man has been forgotten. His rigid mouth kisses a melati flower. Come, let us take him up to heaven, him who has awaited for Adinda till he died. Surely he may not stay behind alone, whose heart had the strength to love so much. Then my rigid mouth shall open once more, to call Adinda whom my heart loves. I will kiss the melati once more, which she gave me. Adinda. Adinda. And still there was nobody on the path leading from Badoer to the Kitapan. Oh, she must have fallen asleep towards morning, tired of watching during the night, of watching for many nights. She had not slept for weeks. So it was. Should he rise and go to Badoer? No, that would be doubting her arrival. Should he call that man who was driving his buffalo to the field? That man was too far off, and, moreover, Saija would speak to no one about Adinda, would ask no one after Adinda. He would see her again, he would see her alone, he would see her first. Oh, surely, surely she would soon come. He would wait, wait. But if she were ill or dead? Like a wounded stag, Saja flew along the path leading from Naketapan to the village where Adinda lived. He saw nothing and heard nothing, and yet he could have heard something, for there were men standing in the road at the entrance of the village, who cried, "Saja! Saja!" But was it his hurry, his eagerness, that prevented him from finding Adinda's house? He had already rushed to the end of the road, through the village, and like one mad he returned and beat his head, because he must have passed her house without seeing it. But again he was at the entrance of the village, and oh, God, was it a dream? Again he had not found the house of Adinda. Again he flew back and suddenly stood still, seized his head with both his hands to press away the madness that overcame him, and cried aloud, "Drunk! Drunk! I am drunk!" And the women of Badur came out of their houses and saw with sorrow poor Saja standing there, for they knew him, and understood that he was looking for the house of Adinda, and they knew that there was no house of Adinda in the village of Badur, for when the district chief of Parang Kujang had taken away Adinda's father's buffaloes. I told you, reader, that my narrative was monotonous. Adinda's mother died of grief, and her baby sister died because she had no mother, and had no one to suckle her, and Adinda's father, who feared to be punished for not paying his land taxes I know that my tale is monotonous had fled out of the country. He had taken Adinda and her brothers with him, but he had heard how the father of Saja had been punished at Buitenzorg with stripes for leaving Badur without a passport, and therefore Adinda's father had not gone to Buitenzorg, nor to the Priangan, nor to Bantam. He had gone to Chilankahan, the quarter of Lebak bordering on the sea. There he had concealed himself in the woods, and waited for the arrival of Pa Ento, Pa Lonta, Si Oinya, Pa Ansiv, Abduel Isma, and some others that had been robbed of their buffaloes by the district chief of Parang Kujang, and all of them feared punishment for not paying their land taxes. There they had at night taken possession of a fishing boat and gone to sea. They had steered toward the west, and kept the country to the right of them as far as Java Head. Then they had steered northward till they came in sight of Prince's Island, and sailed round the east coast of that island, and from there to the Lampoons. Such at least was the way that people told each other in whispers in Lebak, when there was a question of buffalo robbery and unpaid land taxes. But Saijo did not well understand what they said to him. He did not even quite understand the news of his father's death. There was a buzzing in his ears, as if a gong had been sounded in his head. He felt the blood throbbing convulsively through the veins of his temples, that threatened to yield under the pressure of such severe distension. He spoke not, and looked about as one stupefied, without seeing what was round and about him, and at last he began to laugh horribly. An old woman led him to her cottage and took care of the poor fool. Soon he laughed less horribly, but still did not speak. But during the night the inhabitants of the hut were frightened at his voice when he sang monotonously, "I do not know where I shall die," and some inhabitants of Badur put money together to bring a sacrifice to the Bojajaj, crocodiles, to bring a sacrifice to the crocodiles. Such sacrifices are much in vogue. Some fruits and some pastry or a few hen's eggs are placed on a saucer of bamboo. One or more burning wax lights are added. All this is placed on the river, and the floating down of many such sacrifices is a beautiful sight. To the Bojajas of the Chi Ujung for the cure of Saija, whom they thought insane. But he was not insane. For upon a certain night when the moon was very clear he rose from the bale couch, softly left the house and sought the place where Adinda had lived. This was not easy, because so many houses had fallen down, but he seemed to recognize the place by the width of the angle which some rays of light formed through the trees, at their meeting in his eye as the sailor measures by lighthouses and the tops of mountains. Yes, there it ought to be. There Adinda had lived. Stumbling over half-rotten bamboo and pieces of the fallen roof, he made his way to the sanctuary which he sought, and indeed he found something of the still-standing pagar enclosure, near to which the bale of Adinda had stood, and even the pin of bamboo was still with its point in that pagar, the pin on which she hung her dress when she went to bed. But the bale had fallen down like the house, and was almost turned to dust. He took a handful of it, pressed it to his opened lips, and breathed very hard. The following day he asked the old woman who had taken care of him where the rice floor was which stood in the grounds of Adinda's house. The woman rejoiced to hear him speak and ran through the village to seek the floor. When she could point out the new proprietor to Saija, he followed her silently, and being brought to the rice floor, he counted thereupon 32 lines. Then he gave the woman as many piastres as were required to buy a buffalo, and left Badur. At Jilankahan he bought a fishing boat, and after having sailed 2 days arrived in the Lampoons, where the insurgents were in insurrection against the Dutch rule. He joined a troop of Badur men, not so much to fight as to seek Adinda, for he had a tender heart and was more disposed to sorrow than to bitterness. One day that the insurgents had been beaten he wandered through a village that had just been taken by the Dutch army, and was therefore the address of the Lieutenant General van Swieten to his soldiers. See Ideas of Multatuli, first bundle, and the speech of Mr. Douwes Dekker in the Annales of the International Congress of the Promotion of Social Science, Amsterdam, 1864. The village was therefore in flames. Saija knew that the troop that had been destroyed there consisted for the most part of Badur men. He wandered like a ghost among the houses which were not yet burned down, and found the corpse of Adinda's father with a bayonet wound in the breast. Near him Saija saw the 3 murdered brothers of Adinda, still boys, children, and a little further lay the corpse of Adinda, naked and horribly mutilated. A small piece of blue linen had penetrated into the gaping wound in the breast, which seemed to have made an end to a long struggle. Then Saija went to meet some soldiers who were driving at the point of the bayonet the surviving insurgents into the fire of the burning houses. He embraced the broad bayonets, pressed forward with all his might, and still repulsed the soldiers with a last exertion, until their weapons were buried to the sockets in his breast. A little time afterwards there was much rejoicing at Batavia for the new victory, which so added to the laurels of the Dutch India army, and the governor wrote that tranquillity had been restored in the Lampoons. The King of Holland, enlightened by his statesmen, again rewarded so much heroism with many orders of knighthood. And probably thanksgiving mounted to heaven from the hearts of the saints in churches and tabernacles at the news that the Lord of hosts had again fought under the banner of Holland. But God, moved with so much woe, did not accept the sacrifices of that day. But God in highest displeasure turned away, and honored not the offerings of that day. I have made the end of the history of Saija shorter than I could have done if I had felt inclined to paint something dreary. The reader will have observed how I lingered over the description of the waiting under the ketapan, as if I was afraid of the sad catastrophe, and how I glided over that with aversion. And yet that was not my intention when I began to speak about Saija, for I feared that stronger colors were requisite to move when describing such strange circumstances. Yet while writing I felt that it would be an insult to the reader to believe that I ought to have put more blood in my picture. I could have done it, for I have documents before me, but no, rather a confession. Yes, a confession. I do not know whether Saija loved Adinda. I know not whether he went to Badur, nor whether he died in the lampoons by Dutch bayonets. I do not know whether his father died by being beaten with rods, because he left Badur without a passport. I do not know whether Adinda counted the moons by lines in her rice floor. All this I do not know. But I know more than all this. I know, and I can prove it, that there were many Adindas and many Saijas, and that what was fiction in one case becomes truth generally speaking. I have already said that I can give the names of persons who, like the parents of Saija and Adinda, were driven away by oppression from their country. It is not my intention to publish in this book communications such as would be suitable for a tribunal that had to decide on the manner in which the Dutch power is exercised in India, communications that would have the power to convince him only who had patience enough to read them all, which cannot be expected of the public that looks for recreation in its reading. Therefore, instead of barren names of persons and places with the dates, instead of a copy of the list of thefts and extortions which lies before me, I have tried to give a sketch of what can take place in the hearts of the poor people who are robbed of their means of subsistence. Or even I have only made you guess this, as I feared to be mistaken in painting emotions which I never experienced. But as regards the main point, oh, that I were summoned to prove what I wrote! Oh, that it were said, "You invented that Saija. He never sang that lay. There never lived an Adinda in Badur." Oh, that it were said, with the power and the will to do justice as soon as I have proved myself to have been no slanderer! Is there untruth in the parable of the Good Samaritan, because perhaps a plunderer traveler was never taken to the Samaritan's house? Is there untruth in the parable of the sower, because it is clear that no husbandman will throw his seed on a rock? Or, to descend to more conformity with my book, can the main thing, truth, be denied to Uncle Tom's Cabin, because there never existed an Evangeline? Shall people say to the author of that immortal protest, immortal not because of art or talent, but because of tendency and impression, shall they say to her, "You have lied. The slaves are not ill-treated, for there is untruth in your book. It is a novel"? Had not she to give a tale instead of an enumeration of barren facts, a tale which surrounded those facts, to introduce them into our hearts? Would her book have been read if she had given it the form of a lawsuit? Is it her fault or mine that truth, to find entrance, has so often to borrow the dress of a lie? And to some who will pretend that I have too much idealized Saija and his love, I ask how they can know this, as only very few Europeans have given themselves the trouble to stoop to observe the emotions of the coffee and sugar machines called natives. And even if this observation were well founded, whosoever quotes this as a proof against the cardinal tendency of my book gives me a complete triumph, for that observation, when translated, is as follows: "The evil which you combat does not exist, or not in such a high degree, because the native is not like your Saija. There is not in the ill treatment of the Javanese so much evil as there would be if you had rightly drawn your Saija. The Sundanese do not sing such songs, do not love so, do not feel thus. No, colonial ministers, no, Governor General in retirement, you have not to prove that. You have to prove that the population is not ill-treated, whether there are sentimental Saijas amongst this population or not. Or, should you dare to pretend that you may steal buffaloes of men who do not love, who do not sing melancholy songs, who are not sentimental? On an attack upon literary performances I should defend the exactness of the picture of Saija, but on political grounds I admit immediately all observations on this exactness to prevent the great question from being removed to a wrong basis. It is quite indifferent to me whether I am thought to be an incapable painter, if it is only admitted that the ill treatment of the native is excessive. That is the word on the notice of Havelaar's predecessor, which he showed to the Controller Verbrugge, a notice which lies before me. But I have other proofs, and that is fortunate, for this predecessor of Havelaar could also have been mistaken. Alas, if he was mistaken, he has been very severely punished for his mistake. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Max Havelaar by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Continuation of Sterne's composition. It was afternoon. Havelaar, coming out of his room, found Tine in a foregallery, waiting for him at the tea-table. Madame Slaughtering had just left her house, and seemed to have the intention of going to Havelaar's, but suddenly she went to the gate, and there, with very violent gestures, sent back a man who had just entered. She remained standing still till she felt sure that he had gone away, and then returned along the grass-field to Havelaar's. "I will know at last what this means," said Havelaar, and when the salutation was over he asked jokingly that she might not think he grudged her influence in grounds which formerly were hers. "Now, madam, do tell me why you always send back the men who come into the grounds. What if that man, for instance, had fowls to sell, or any other kitchen requisite?" There was in the face of Madame Slaughtering a painful expression which did not escape Havelaar's observation. "Ah," she said, "there are so many bad men." "Certainly that is the case everywhere, but if you are so particular the good ones will stay away too. Come now, madam, tell me why you keep such a sharp lookout over the grounds." Havelaar looked at her and endeavored in vain to read the reply in her watery eyes. He again pressed for an explanation, and the widow burst into tears, saying that her husband had been poisoned at Parang Kujang, in the house of the district chief. "He would do justice, Mr. Havelaar," continued the poor woman. "He wished to put an end to the oppression of the people. He exhorted and threatened the chiefs in councils and in writing. You must have found his letters in the archives." That was the case. Havelaar had read those letters, of which I have copies before me. "He spoke repeatedly to the Resident," continued the widow, "but always in vain, for as it was generally known that the extortion was for and under the protection of the Regent, whom the Resident would not complain of to the government, all these conversations had no other effect than the ill treatment of the complainants. Therefore my poor husband had said that if no alteration should be made before the end of the year, he would apply direct to the Governor-General. That was in November. A few days later he made a journey of inspection, took his dinner at the house of Demang of Parang Kujang, and soon afterwards was brought home in a pitiable condition. He cried while pointing to his stomach, 'Fire! Fire!' and in a few hours he was dead. He who had always been remarkable for good health." "Did you send for the Serang doctor?" asked Havelaar. "Yes, but my husband died soon after his arrival. I did not dare to tell the doctor my suspicion, because I foresaw that I should not be able soon to leave this place, and I feared revenge. I have heard that you, like my husband, oppose the abuses which reign here, and therefore I have not a moment's peace. I would have concealed all this from you to avoid frightening you and Madame Havelaar, and so I only watched the grounds to prevent strangers from entering the kitchen." Now it was clear to Tine why Madame Slaughtering had kept her own household, and would not even make use of the kitchen, which was so large. Havelaar sent for the Controller. Meanwhile he sent a request to the physician at Serang to make a statement of the symptoms attending the death of Slaughterring. The reply which he received the next day to that request was not in accordance with the widow's suspicions. According to the doctor, Slaughterring had died of an abscess in the liver. I do not know whether such a disease can manifest itself suddenly and cause death in a few hours. I think I must bear in mind the evidence of Madame Slaughterring that her husband had formerly been always healthy. But if no value is attached to such evidence, because the notion of what is called health varies with different persons, particularly in the eyes of non-medical individuals, yet the important question remains, whether a person who dies today of an abscess in the liver could ride on horseback yesterday, with the intention of inspecting a mountainous country, which is in some directions 80 miles in extent. The doctor who treated Slaughterring may have been a skillful physician, and yet have been mistaken in his judgment of the symptoms of the disease, unprepared as he was to suspect crime. However this may be, I cannot prove that Havelaar's predecessor was poisoned, because Havelaar was not allowed time to clear up the matter. But I can prove that every one believed in the poisoning, and that this was suspected on account of his desire to oppose injustice. The Controller Verbrugge entered Havelaar's room. The latter asked abruptly, "What did Mr. Slaughterring die of?" "I don't know." "Was he poisoned?" "I don't know. But speak plainly, Verbrugge." "But he endeavored to oppose the abuses, as you do, and he would certainly have been poisoned if he had remained here longer." "Write that down." Verbrugge wrote it. It lies before me. To proceed, is it true or untrue that much extortion is committed in Labac? Verbrugge made no reply. "Answer me, Verbrugge." "I dare not." "Write down that you dare not." Verbrugge wrote it down. It lies before me. Well, to proceed, you dare not answer the last question. You told me lately, when there was a question about poisoning, that you were the only support of your sisters at Batavia. Is that the reason of your fear, of what I always called your halfness? Yes. Verbrugge wrote it down. His declaration lies before me. "That will do," said Havelaar. "I know enough." And Verbrugge left. Havelaar went out and played with little Max, whom he kissed very fervently. When Madame Slaughterring was gone, he sent away the child, and called in Tine. "Dear Tine, I have a favor to ask you. I should like you and Max to go to Batavia. Today I accuse the Regent." She fell on his neck for the first time opposed to his wishes, and cried, sobbing, "No, Max, no, Max, I will not go, I will not go. We eat and drink together." Was Havelaar wrong when he made out that she had as little right to blow her nose as the women at Arles? He wrote and dispatched the letter, of which I here present a copy. After I have given a slight sketch of the circumstances under which that letter was written, I believe that it is not necessary for me to show the circumspection which he observed, while not uttering a syllable of the discovery just made, not to weaken his positive accusation by the uncertainty of a very important but as yet unproved accusation. His intention was to exhume the corpse of his predecessor, and to have it scientifically examined as soon as the Regent should have been removed and his party made harmless. But, as I have already said, he was not allowed the opportunity of doing this. In the copies of official documents, copies which strictly conform with the originals, I think I may use single pronouns instead of the foolish titles. I expect that the good taste of my readers will approve this change. Number 88, Private, Immediate, Rangkas Betong, 24th February, 1856. To the Resident of Bantan. Since returning a month ago to my duties here, I have occupied myself principally in examining how the chiefs discharge their obligations towards the population as regards statute labor, pundutan, note, Puntutan is the obtaining of provisions and goods under the pretext of government service. In the journeys of important personages invited by the regent or district chiefs, all necessaries are supplied by the population, and that as often as required. And such like. I very soon discovered that the regent, on his own responsibility and for his advantage, summoned the population to work for him, far above the legally authorized number of panjans or kemits, followers and serving people summoned to increase the pomp and attend upon the chief or other personage. I hesitated between the choice of sending at once an official report and the desire to make this native functionary change his policy by gentle means, or even afterwards by threats, in order to attain the double purpose of putting an end to abuse, and at the same time not acting too severely against this old servant of the government, particularly considering the bad examples which, I believe, have often been set before him, and in connection with the peculiar circumstances that he expected a visit from two relations, the regents of Bombang and Chandor, at least of the latter, who, as I hear, is already coming with a large train, and he being thus more than usually in temptation, and with regard to the critical embarrassment of his pecuniary circumstances, as it were obliged, to provide by unlawful means the necessary preparations for that visit. All this made me incline to moderation, with regard to what had already happened, but not at all to indulgence for the future. I insisted upon the immediate cessation of every unlawful act. I made you acquainted with that previous experiment to induce the regent by moderation to do his duty. Yet it is evident to me that he casts all to the winds with rude insolence, and I feel bound to communicate to you, in virtue of my official oath, that I accuse the regent of Lebak, Radinadipati Kartanata Negara, of abuse of power, by disposing unlawfully of the labor of his subordinates, and suspect him of extortion while exacting productions in natura without payment or for prices arbitrarily fixed. That I suspect, moreover, the Demang of Parangujang, the regent's son-in-law, of complicity in the above-mentioned abuses. In order conclusively to prove both these charges, I take the liberty of proposing to you to order me, 1. To send the regent of Lebak with the utmost speed to Serang, and to take care that he shall not have occasion, either before his departure or during the journey, to influence, by corruption or any other way, the witnesses. I require, 2. Previously to take the Demang of Parangkujang into custody. 3. To apply the same measure to such persons of inferior rank as, belonging to the family of the regent, may be expected to mar the impartiality of the examination to be instituted. 4. To order that examination to take place immediately, and to report circumstantially on the issue. I take the liberty of submitting to your consideration the advisability of countermanding the visit of the regent of Chanjar. Finally, I have the honor to give you, as one who knows the district of Lebak better than it is as yet possible for me to know it, the assurance that, from a political point of view, the strictly just treatment of this affair has no difficulty at all, and that I should be rather apprehensive if it was not cleared up, for I am informed that the poor man is, as a witness told me, posing, tired, sick, disgusted, of all the vexation he has suffered, and that he has long sought relief. I have partly derived the strength to fulfill my difficult duty in writing this letter from the hope that I may be allowed in due time to bring forward one or two excuses for the old regent, for whose position, though caused by his own fault, I nevertheless feel great compassion. The Assistant Resident at Lebak. (Signed) Max Havelaar. The next day the resident of Bantan replied, "No," but Mr. Slimmering did so in a private letter. That reply is a precious contribution to the knowledge of how the government is carried on in Dutch India. Mr. Slimmering complained that Havelaar had not first communicated verbally to him the affair mentioned in the letter No. 88, of course because then there would have been more chance of arranging matters, adding moreover that Havelaar disturbed him in pressing business. The man was surely busy in writing the yearly report on Tranquil Tranquillity. I have that letter before me, and do not trust my eyes. I read once more the letter of the assistant resident of Lebak. I compare Havelaar and Slimmering. This Scholman is a low beggar. You must know, reader, that Bastianus is again very often absent from the office, because he has gout. Now, as I cannot reconcile it with my conscience to throw away the funds of the firm, Last & Company, for where principles are concerned I am immovable. I thought the day before yesterday that Scholman wrote a good hand, and as he looked so very poor, that he could therefore certainly be got for small wages. I therefore thought that it was my duty to provide in the cheapest manner for the removal of Bastianus. I went accordingly to Scholman's house in the Van de Leidse Dwarsstraat, Long Leiden Cross Street. The woman of the shop was at the door, but she seemed not to recognize me, though I had lately told her that I was Mr. Dreistable, coffee broker, of the L'Oreal Canal. There is always a sort of insult in such a non-recognition, but as it was now not so cold, and as I wore last time I was there my coat trimmed with fur, I ascribed it to that, and think nothing of it. I mean the insult. I said therefore again that I was Mr. Dreistable, of the Laurier Canal, coffee broker, and begged her to go and see if Scholman was in, because I did not wish, as on the last occasion, to have to speak to his wife, who is always discontented. But the woman refused to go upstairs. She could not walk up and down stairs the whole day for that beggarly family, said she, but I could go and look for myself. And then followed again a description of the staircase and doors, which I had no need of, for I always know a place where I have been once, because I pay such attention to everything. I have got accustomed to that in my business. So I went upstairs, and knocked at the well-known door, which opened. I entered, and as I saw nobody in the room I looked round. There was not much to be seen. A child's trousers with an embroidered stripe hung over a chair. Why need such people wear embroidered trousers? In a corner stood a not very heavy traveling box, which I lifted up by the hinge, and on the mantelpiece there were some books, which I looked at, a curious collection, a couple of volumes of Byron, Horace, Bastiat, Béranger, and, do guess, a Bible, a complete Bible with the Apocrypha. This I had not expected of Scholman. It appeared also to have been read, for I found many notes on loose pieces of paper relating to the Scriptures, all written in the same handwriting as the pieces in that unwelcome parcel. Above all, he seemed to have studied carefully the book of Job, for there the leaves bore the marks of it. I think that he begins to feel the chastisement of the Lord, and will therefore reconcile himself to God by reading the Holy Scriptures, and I am not opposed to that. But while waiting my eye caught sight of a lady's work-box which stood on the table. Without thinking about it, I looked at it. There were in it a pair of half-finished child's stockings, a lot of foolish verses, and a letter addressed to Scholman's wife, as could be seen by the inscription. The letter was open, and it seemed as if it had been rumpled with some anger. Now it is a firm principle with me never to read anything that is not addressed to me, because I do not think it respectable. I never do such a thing when I have no interest in it, but now I got an inspiration that it was my duty to read this letter, because the contents would perhaps further me in the humane intentions that made me go to Scholman. I thought about it, how the Lord is always near to those who believe in him, as he gave me here quite unexpectedly an opportunity to know a little more about this man, and protected me, too, from the danger of performing an act of charity to an immoral person. I pay much attention to such directions of the Lord. This has done me a great deal of good in business. With much surprise I saw that the wife of Shulman belongs to a respectable family. The letter at least was signed by a relation whose name in Holland is respected, and I was indeed in ecstasies with the beautiful contents of those lines. It appeared to be from a person who labored zealously for the Lord, for he wrote that the wife of Shulman ought to be divorced from such a wretch, who made her suffer poverty, who could not earn his livelihood, who was, moreover, a rascal because he had debts; that the writer of the letter pitied her condition, though that condition was her own fault, because she had forsaken the Lord and stuck to Shulman; that she ought to return to the Lord, and that in that case her family would all of them assist her, and furnish her with needlework, but before all things she ought to put away this Shulman, who was a disgrace to the family. In a word, you could not get in church itself more piety than was to be found in this letter. I knew enough, and was grateful to have been warned in such a miraculous way. Without this warning I should certainly have become a victim of my own good heart. I resolved, therefore, again to keep Bastianus till I could find a fitter person to take his place, for I do not like to turn any one to the streets. The reader will be curious to know how I got on at the Rosemeyers' last party. I was not there. Wonderful things have happened. I had gone to Drybergen with my wife and Mary. My father-in-law, old Mr. Last, the son of the first Last (the Meyers were then still in the firm, but they have left it long ago), said some years ago that he should like to see my wife and Mary. Now it was very fine weather, and my fear of the love history with which Sterne had menaced us made me think all at once of this invitation. I spoke of it to our bookkeeper, who is a man of experience, and who, after mature deliberation, recommended me to sleep a night on it. This I intended immediately to carry out, for I am quick in the execution of my decisions. The following day I perceived already how wise this advice was, for during the night I got the idea that I could not do better than delay my decision till Friday. In a word, after having carefully considered all things, there was much in favor of the plan, but also much against it. We went on Saturday afternoon and came back on Monday morning. I would not tell you all this if it was not in connection with my book. First of all, I think it necessary that you should know why I do not protest against the nonsense which Sterne certainly brought out last Sunday. What nonsense is that about a person who would hear when he was dead? Mary mentioned it to me. She had heard it from the Rosemeyers, who trade in sugar. Secondly, because I am now again convinced that all those stories about misery and trouble in the East Indies are downright lies. Thus it may be seen how traveling gives a person the opportunity to penetrate deeply into affairs. Saturday evening, for instance, my father-in-law had accepted an invitation from a gentleman who had been formerly a resident in the East Indies, and who lives now at a large country seat. We went there, and, indeed, I cannot sufficiently praise the excellent reception we met with. Our host sent his carriage to fetch us, and the coachman had on a red waistcoat. Now it was certainly a little too cold to inspect the country seat, which must be magnificent in the summer, but in the house itself there was nothing to desire, for it was replete with luxury: a billiard-room, a library, a covered iron and glass conservatory, and a cockatoo on a silver perch. I never saw such a thing. I made the observation, how good conduct is always rewarded. That man had been attentive to his business was evident, for he had more than 3 orders of knighthood. He had a beautiful country seat, and, moreover, a house in Amsterdam. At the supper all was truffé, and even the servants who waited at table wore red waistcoats, like the coachman. As I take great interest in Indian affairs because of the coffee, I began a conversation on the subject, and perceived very soon what I had to think about it. This resident told me that he was always very well off in the East Indies, and that there was, therefore, not a word of truth in those stories of discontent among the population. I turned the conversation upon Shallman. He knew him, and that unfavorably. He said that the government had done well in dismissing him, for that this Shallman was a very discontented person, who made remarks about everything, and there was, moreover, much to disapprove in his own conduct. For instance, he was always running away with girls, and bringing them home openly before his wife. He did not pay his debts, a thing which is very unseemly. As I knew so exactly from the letter I had read how well founded this accusation was, I was very well pleased to find that I had judged of all so correctly, and was quite satisfied with myself. I am also known for this at the Exchange, I mean for always possessing a sound judgment. This resident and his wife were agreeable and kind. They told us much of their manner of life in the Indies. It must be very pleasant there. They said that their country seat near Drybergen was not half so large as that they called their grounds, in the interior of Java, and that 100 men were required to keep it in order. But, and this is proof of how they were liked, all this was done for nothing, and out of pure attachment. They told us also that, when they went away, the sale of their furniture had produced a large profit, as it fetched 10 times its value, for that the native chiefs were all of them so fond of buying a keepsake of a resident. I told this afterwards to Sterne, who maintained that this was done by coercion, and that he could prove it out of Shallman's parcel. But I told him that this Shallman was a slanderer, that he had run away with girls, like that young German at Busselinck and Waterman's, that I did not attach the least value to his judgment, for that I had now learnt from a resident himself how matters stood, and had therefore nothing to learn from Shallman. There were still more persons from the Indies, amongst others a very rich gentleman, who had gained much money on tea, which the Javanese made him for little money, and which the government bought from him for a high price, to encourage the activity of the Javanese. This gentleman was also very angry with all those discontented persons who are always speaking and writing against the government. He could not say enough in praise of the government of the colonies, for he said that he had the conviction that it lost a great deal in tea which it bought from him, and that was therefore very generous in invariably paying such a high price for an article, intrinsically of little value, which he himself did not like, for he always drank Chinese tea. He said also that the Governor-General, who had prolonged the so-called tea contracts, notwithstanding the calculation that the nation lost so much on this, such a clever, good man was he, and, above all, a good friend of those who had known him formerly, for that this Governor-General had not paid the least attention to the talk about losses on the tea, and had done him therefore a great deal of good by not cancelling those tea contracts. "Yes," he went on, "my heart bleeds when I perceive that such noble persons are slandered. If he had not been there, I should have to walk with my wife and children." Thereupon he ordered his carriage, and it looked so magnificent, and the horses were so beautiful and so fat, that I can understand why he is full of gratitude to such a Governor-General. It does one's heart good to behold such charming emotions, above all when comparing them with that accursed grumbling and complaining of persons like that Shallman. The following day the resident and that gentleman for whom the Javanese make tea returned our visit. Both of them at once asked us by what train we thought of going to Amsterdam. We did not know what this meant, but afterwards it was clear to us, for when we arrived there on Monday morning there were 2 servants at the station, one with a red waistcoat and one with a yellow one, who both at the same time told us that he had received an order by telegram to fetch us in a carriage. My wife was confused, and I thought, what would Busselinck and Waterman have said if they had seen that? I mean that there were two carriages for us. But it was not easy to make a choice, for I could not resolve to hurt one of the parties by refusing such a nice offer. Good advice was dear, but I came victorious out of this great difficulty. I put my wife and Mary in the red carriage, the red waistcoat, I mean, and I went in the yellow one, I mean the carriage. How those horses tore along! On the Whisper Street, where it is always so dirty, the mud flew as high as the houses, and there I saw the miserable shawlman, his back bent, his head bowed down, and I saw how he tried to wipe the mud off his pale face with the sleeve of his threadbare coat. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Max Havelaar by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, composed by Sterne. In the private letter which Mr. Slimmering sent to Havelaar, he communicated to him that he, notwithstanding his pressing business, would come the next day to Rangkas-Beton to deliberate on what ought to be done. Havelaar, who knew what such a deliberation meant (his predecessor had so often deliberated with the resident of Pantam), wrote the following letter, which he sent to meet the resident and be read by him before his arrival at Labec. No. 91, Private Immediate. Rangkas-Beton, 25th February, 1856, 11 p.m. Yesterday at 12 o'clock I had the honor to send you my missive, immediate, No. 88, containing in substance that I, after a long investigation and after having tried in vain to bring back by moderation the party concerned from his perversity, felt myself obliged by my official oath to accuse the Regent of Labec of abuse of power, and to add that I suspected him of extortion. I have taken the liberty to propose to you in that letter to summon that native chief to Serang in order to examine after his departure, and after the corrupting influence of his extensive family had been neutralized, whether my accusation and suspicion were well founded. Long, or to speak more accurately, much have I reflected before determining upon this. I took care to let you know that I have endeavored, by exhortation and threats, to save the old Regent from misfortune and shame, and myself from the deep regret of having been the immediate cause of his troubles. But on the other hand I saw the, for many years, plundered and much oppressed population. I thought of the necessity of an example, for I shall have to report to you many more vexations, if at least this affair, by its reaction, makes no end of them, and I repeat it, after mature consideration, I did what I thought to be my duty. I have just received your kind and esteemed private letter communicating that you will come here to-morrow, and at the same time a hint that I ought to have treated this affair privately at first. To-morrow I shall therefore have the honor to see you, and it is exactly on that account that I have taken the liberty to send you this letter, to add, before our meeting, the following considerations. All my investigations about the Regent were quite secret. Only he and the Pate, adjutant of the Regent, knew it, for I myself had frankly warned him. Even the Controller knows only a part of my investigations. This secrecy had a double aim. At first, when I still hoped to bring back the Regent to the right way, it was my object, if I succeeded, not to compromise him. The Pate thanked me in the name of the Regent for this discretion. It was on the 12th inst. But afterwards, when I began to despair of the success of my endeavors, or rather when the measure of my indignation overflowed on hearing of a recent occurrence, when a longer silence would have become participation as an accomplice, then that secrecy would have been to my advantage, for I too have to fulfill duties towards my household and myself. For after writing my letter of yesterday, I should be unworthy to serve the government if what I wrote down then was vain, unfounded, or invented, and would or will it be possible to me to prove that I have done what a good assistant resident ought to do, to prove that I am not unworthy the functions which I have received, to prove that I do not risk thoughtlessly and rashly my 17 hard years in the service of the government, and, what is of more importance still, the interest of wife and child, will it be possible for me to prove all this unless deep secrecy does not hide my investigations and prevent the criminal from concealing himself? At the least suspicion the Regent would send an express to his nephew, who is coming here, and whose interest it is to maintain him at any sacrifice, and to distribute money with a profuse hand to every one whom he had recently swindled. The consequence would be, I need not say will be, that I have passed a rash judgment and am an unserviceable functionary, not to say worse. To prevent that result I write this letter. I have the highest esteem for you, but I know the spirit of East Indian functionaries, and I do not possess that spirit. Your hint that it would have been better to have treated the affair privately at first makes me apprehensive of such a course. What I said in my missive of yesterday is true, but perhaps it would seem untrue if the affair was treated in such a manner as would reveal my accusation and suspicion before the removal of the Regent. I may not conceal from you that even your unexpected arrival in connection with the express sent by me yesterday to Serang gives me reason to fear that the accused, who would not listen to my exhortations, will now awake too soon, and endeavor, if possible, tant soit peu, to exculpate himself. I have the honor to say that I still refer literally to my missive of yesterday, but I take the liberty to observe that this missive contained a proposal to remove the Regent before the investigation, and previously to make his adherents harmless, and at the same time that I believe myself to be no further responsible for what I advanced than so far as you may be pleased to agree to my proposition as regards the manner of investigation, that it should be impartial, open, and above all free. This liberty cannot exist before the removal of the Regent, and according to my humble opinion there is nothing dangerous in that, as he can be told that I accuse him, and suspect him, that I am in danger, and not he, in the event of his innocence being established. For I myself am of opinion that I ought to be dismissed, if it shall appear that I have acted precipitately or rashly. Precipitately, after years and years of abuses; rashly, as if an honest man could sleep and live and enjoy, while they, over whose welfare he is called upon to watch, who are in the highest sense his neighbors, suffer extortion and injustice. I have been here, it is true, but a short time. I hope, however, that the question will, for once, be what has been done, if anything has been well done, and not whether it has been done in too short a time. For me every moment is too long, when characterized by extortion and oppression, and every second weighs heavy on me that is passed in misery by my negligence, by my spirit of arranging. I regret the days which I allowed to pass away before reporting to you officially, and I apologize for that neglect. I have taken the liberty to request you to give me the opportunity to justify my letter of yesterday, and to guarantee me against the miscarriage of my endeavors to free the province of Lebac from the worms which have gnawed, since the memory of man, at its welfare. It is therefore that I have again taken the liberty of asking you to approve my action, which consists only of investigating, reporting, and proposing to remove the Regent of Lebac, without direct or indirect notice beforehand, and moreover to order an investigation to take place of what I communicated in my letter of yesterday, number 88. The Assistant Resident of Labec. Signed, Max Havelaar. This request not to take the criminals under his protection the Resident received on the way. An hour after his arrival at Rangkas-Beton he paid a visit to the Regent, and asked him whether he could say anything to the prejudice of the Assistant Resident, and whether he, the Regent, wanted money. To the first question the Regent replied, "I have nothing against him, I can solemnly swear to that." The second question he answered in the affirmative, whereupon the Resident gave him a couple of bank notes. It may be understood that Havelaar knew nothing of this. We shall see by and by how he became acquainted with so shameful a transaction. When the Resident Slimmering entered Havelaar's house he was paler than usual, and the intervals between his words were longer than ever. It was indeed no small thing for a man who so excelled in arranging and making out the yearly reports of tranquillity to receive so unexpectedly letters in which there was no trace either of optimism or of artificial coloring, or of fear of the disapprobation of the government. The Resident of Bantam was in a fright, and if I may be forgiven the ignoble comparison for the sake of exactness, I feel inclined to liken him to a little street boy who complains of the violation of old customs, because he has been beaten without previous abusive language. He began by asking the Controller why the latter had not endeavored to restrain Havelaar from his accusation. Poor Verbrugge, who was entirely unacquainted with the circumstances, said so, but was not believed. Mr. Slimmering could not believe that any person without assistance could do his duty in such a manner. As Verbrugge, however, maintained his ignorance, the Resident began to read Havelaar's letters. What Verbrugge suffered in listening is indescribable. He was an honest man, and would not have lied if Havelaar had appealed to him to confirm the truth of the contents of these letters. But even without that honesty he had not always been able to avoid the truth in many written reports, even where it was dangerous to tell it. How would it be if Havelaar made use of those reports? After having read these letters the Resident said that if Havelaar chose to recall these documents it would be agreeable to him to consider them as not written, which Havelaar firmly but politely refused. Having in vain tried to move him to this, the Resident said that he must investigate the charges, and that he had therefore to request Havelaar to summon the witnesses in support of the accusation he had brought against the Regent. Ye poor creatures, whose sides had been wounded by the thorns in the ravine, how anxiously would your hearts have beaten if you could have heard this request. And you, poor Verbrugge, you first witness, chief witness, ex officio witness, a witness in virtue of office and oath, a witness who had already borne witness on paper, which lay there on the table under Havelaar's hand. Havelaar replied, "Mr. Resident, I am Assistant Resident of Labec. I have promised to protect the population from extortion and tyranny. I accuse the Regent and his son-in-law of parang kujang. I will prove my accusation as soon as that opportunity is given me, which I proposed in my letters. I am guilty of slander if this accusation is false." How freely Verbrugge breathed again, and how strange the Resident thought Havelaar's words. The conversation lasted long. With politeness, for Slimmering was polite and well bred, he urged Havelaar to turn aside from such wrong principles, but with as much politeness the latter remained immovable. The result was that the Resident had to yield, in saying as a threat what was to Havelaar a victory, that he should be compelled to bring the matter under the notice of the government. The meeting was ended. The Resident paid the visit to the Regent to put to him the questions already mentioned, and then dined at the scanty board of the Havelaars, after which he returned in great haste to Serang, because he had still so much to do. The next day Havelaar received a letter from the Resident of Bantam, the contents of which may be understood from the reply, of which I here give a copy. No. 93, Private, Rangkas Betong, 28th February, 1856. I have had the honor to receive your missive of the 26th inst. La. O. Private, containing mainly the following: that you had reasons for not accepting the proposals made in both my official letters of the 24th and 25th inst., Nos. 88 and 91, that you had desired a previous confidential communication, that you do not approve of my transactions described in both those letters, and lastly some orders. I have now the honor again to assert, as I did verbally in the meeting of the day before yesterday, that I fully respect the legality of your power as regards deciding whether to accept my proposition or not, that the orders received shall with exactness be obeyed, with self-sacrifice, if need be, as if you were present to witness all I do or say, or, more properly, all I do not do or do not say. I know that you place confidence in my good faith in this matter, but I take the liberty solemnly to protest against the least semblance of disapprobation of any action, any word, any phrase, done, spoken, or written by me in this matter. I am convinced that I have done my duty, in my object and in the manner of executing it quite my duty, nothing but my duty, without the least deviation. I have long pondered before acting, that is, before examining, reporting, and proposing, and if I have been to a certain extent mistaken in anything, my fault was not precipitancy. In the same circumstances I should do again, yet a little quicker, exactly the same. Even if it happened that a higher power than yours disapproved anything which I did, except perhaps the peculiarity of my style, which is a part of myself, a defect for which I am as little responsible as a stammerer for his defect. Even if that happened, but no, that cannot be, even if it were so, I have done my duty. Certainly I am sorry, yet without being astonished, that you judge differently of this, and as far as regards myself, I should rely upon what appears to me to be a slight, but there is a question about a principle, and I have conscientious reasons which require that it shall be decided which opinion is correct, yours or mine. Serve otherwise than I served at Labac I cannot. If the government desires to be served otherwise, then I shall be obliged as an honest man to ask the government to discharge me. Then I must endeavor, at the age of 36 years, to commence a new career. Then I, after 17 years, after 17 heavy, difficult years of service as a functionary, after having devoted the best of my lifetime to what I considered to be my duty, then I must again ask society for bread, if it will give me bread, for my wife and child, bread in exchange for thoughts, bread perhaps in exchange for labor with spade or wheelbarrow, if the strength of my arm is approved for more than that of my soul. But I cannot and will not believe that your opinion is shared by His Excellency the Governor General, and I am therefore compelled, before I pass to the bitter extreme of what I wrote in the last paragraph, to beg you respectfully to propose to the Government to order the Resident of Bantam to approve so far the transactions of the Assistant Resident of Labac, including his letters of the 24th and 25th inst., Nos. 88 and 91, or to call the above-mentioned Assistant Resident to account on the points of disapprobation to be given by the Resident of Bantam. I have, finally, the honor to give you the grateful assurance that if anything could bring me back from my long calculated and calm but fervently adhered to principles in this, it would have been indeed the polite, engaging manner in which you, at the meeting of the day before yesterday, opposed those principles. The Assistant Resident of Labec. Signed, Max Havelaar. Without deciding as to the correctness of the suspicions of Slaughtering's widow concerning the cause which made her children orphans, and only accepting what may be proved that there was a strong connection in Labec between fulfillment of duty and poison, even if that connection existed only in public opinion, yet it may be conceived that Max and Tine passed sorrowful days after the visit of the Resident. I believe that I need not paint the anguish of a mother who, when offering food to her child, has continually to ask whether she is not perhaps murdering her darling. And certainly little Max was an adored child, who had stayed away 7 years after the marriage, as if the rogue knew that it was no advantage to come into the world as the son of such parents. 29 long days had Havelaar to wait before the Governor-General communicated with him, but we are not yet so far. A short time after the vain endeavor to move Havelaar to withdraw his letters, or to betray the poor people who had confided in his magnanimity, Verbrugge entered Havelaar's house. The good man was deadly pale, and had some difficulty in speaking. "I have been with the Regent," he said. "It is scandalous, but do not betray me." "What? What must I not betray?" "Do you pledge me your word to make no use of what I shall tell you?" "More halfness," said Havelaar. "But well, I pledge my word." And then Verbrugge told Havelaar what the reader knows already, that the Resident had asked the Regent if the latter could say anything against the Assistant Resident, and had quite unexpectedly given him money. At the same time Verbrugge knew it from the Regent himself, who had asked him what reasons the Resident could have had for this. Havelaar was indignant, but he had pledged his word. The next day Verbrugge returned and said that Duclari had told him how ignoble it was to leave Havelaar, who had to fight such opponents, so completely alone, whereupon Verbrugge released him from his pledge. "Very well," said Havelaar, "write it down." Verbrugge wrote it down. This declaration is likewise before me. The reader will have long understood why I renounced so cheaply any pretensions to authenticity in the history of Seija. It was touching to observe how Verbrugge, timorous before he was awakened by the reproaches of Duclari, dared to trust Havelaar's pledged word in a matter which so induced violation of it. And another thing. Years have passed since the events which I relate. Havelaar has suffered much during this time. He has seen the suffering of his household. The documents which lie before me bear witness of this, and it seems that he has waited. I give the following note from his hand: "I read in the newspapers that Mr. Slimering has been made Knight of the Order of the Dutch Lion. He appears to be now Resident of Jogjakarta. I can therefore now speak of the affairs of Labec without danger to Verbrugge." Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Max Havelaar by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Composed by Sterne. It was evening. Tine was reading in the inner gallery, and Havelaar was drawing an embroidery pattern. Little Max was putting together a puzzle picture, and was getting angry because he could not find that red lady's body. "Will it be right so, Tine?" asked Havelaar. "See, I have made this palm a little larger. It is exactly Hogarth's line of beauty." "Yes, Max, but these lace holes are too near each other." "Are they? And the others?" "Max, do let me see your trousers. Have you that stripe?" "Ah, I remember when you embroidered that, Tine." "Not I. Where, then?" It was at The Hague, when Max was ill, and we were so frightened because the physician said that he had such an uncommonly shaped head, and that so much care was required to prevent congestion of the brain. Then you were busy with that stripe." Tina went and kissed the little one. "I have found her stomach! I have found her stomach!" cried the little boy gaily, and the Red Lady was complete. "Whose bedtime is it?" asked the mother. "Mine, but I have not yet supped," said little Max. "You shall have some supper first, of course." And she rose up and gave him his simple supper, which she seemed to have fetched out of a well secured cupboard in her room, for the noise of many locks had been heard. "What are you giving him?" asked Havelaar. "Oh, don't be uneasy. It is biscuit out of the tin box from Batavia, and the sugar, too, has been kept under lock and key." Havelaar's thoughts turned again to the point where they had been interrupted. "Do you know," he continued, "that we have not yet paid that doctor's bill?" "Oh, that is very hard." "Dear Max, we live so economically here. We shall soon be able to pay all. Moreover, you will certainly soon be appointed resident, and then all will be arranged in a little time." "That is exactly the thing that makes me sad," said Havelaar. "I should be so unwilling to leave Labac. I will explain that to you. Don't you believe that we loved our Max more after his illness? Now it appears to me that I shall love poor Labac still more after it has recovered from the cancer from which it has suffered for so many years. The thought of promotion frightens me, and yet on the other side, when I think again that we have debts— "All will be right, Max. Even if you had to go from here, then you could help Labac afterwards on being made Governor-General." Then came wild lines in Havelaar's pattern. There was anger in those flowers. Those strips were sharp, angular, crossing each other. Tina understood that she had said something wrong. "Dear Max," she began kindly. "A curse on it! Will you have them starve so long? Can you live on sand?" "Dear Max!" But he jumped up from his chair, and there was no more drawing that evening. He went up and down in the inner gallery, and at last he spoke in a tone which would have sounded rough and hard to every stranger, but which was thought of quite differently by Tina. "A curse on this indifference, this shameful indifference! Here I have waited a month for justice, and meanwhile the poor people are suffering terribly. The Regent seems to calculate upon nobody daring to take it up against him. Look!" He went into his office and came back with a letter in his hand, a letter which lies before me, reader. "Look, in this letter he dares to make me proposals about the kind of labor which he intends to have done by men whom he has summoned unlawfully. Is that not shamelessness going too far? And do you know who these persons are? They are women with little children, with sucklings, women who are pregnant, who have been driven from Parang Kujang to the capital to work for him. There are no more men. And they have nothing to eat, and they sleep on the road and eat sand. Can you eat sand? Must they eat sand till I am Governor-General? Curse it!" Tina knew very well with whom alone Max was angry, when he spoke thus to her whom he loved. "And," continued Havelaar, "that is all on my responsibility. If at this moment some of these poor creatures are wandering there outside, and seeing the light of our lamps, will say, 'There lives the wretch who ought to protect us. There he sits quietly with his wife and child, and draws embroidery patterns, while we lie here like dogs on the road, and starve with our children.' Yes, I hear it, I hear it, that cry for vengeance upon my head. Here, Max, here!" And he kissed the child with a wildness which frightened it. "My child, if they tell you that I am a wretch, who had no courage to do justice, that so many mothers have died by my fault, if they tell you that the neglect of your father stole away the bliss of your life, Max, bear witness how I suffered." and he burst into tears which Tina kissed away. Then she put little Max to bed, a mat of straw, and when she returned found Havelaar in conversation with Verbrugge and Duclari, who had just come in. The conversation was about the expected decision of the government. "I understand very well that the Resident is in a difficult position," said Duclari. "He cannot advise the government to accept your proposals, for then too much would be brought to light. I have been long in Bantam, and know much about it, more than you, Mr. Havelaar. I was here as sub lieutenant, and in that position one hears things that the native does not dare to tell the functionaries. But if now, after an open investigation, all this comes to light, the Governor General will summon the Resident to account for it, and ask him how it is that he has not discovered in 2 years what was obvious to you immediately. He must, therefore, prevent that investigation." "I have considered that," replied Havelaar, "and put on my guard by his endeavors to move the Regent to say something against me, which seems to show that he will try to remove the question, for instance, by accusing me of I don't know what. I have covered myself against that by sending copies of my letters direct to the government. In one of these letters I beg to be called to account, if perhaps it should be pretended that I had done something wrong. If now the Resident of Bantam attacks me, no decision can be made according to justice before I have been heard. That is allowed even to a criminal, and I have done nothing wrong." "There is the post," said Verbrugge. Yes, it was the post that brought the following letter from the Governor General of the Dutch Indies to Havelaar, late Assistant Resident of Lebak. Official, No. 54, Buitenzorg, 23 March, 1856. The manner in which you have acted on the discovery or supposition of wrongdoing on the part of the chiefs in the district of Lebak, and your attitude towards your superior, the Resident of Bantam, have excited in a high degree my displeasure. In your acts there is not only a want of the deliberate judgment, caution, and prudence so indispensable to a functionary entrusted with power in the interior of Java, but also notions of insubordination to your immediate superior. Only a few days after your appointment to your present office, you made the head of the native government of Lebak the subject of irritating examinations, without first consulting the Resident. In these examinations you found cause, without substantiating your accusations against that chief by facts, much less by proofs, to make proposals which tended to subject a native functionary of the rank of the Regent of Lebak, a man of 60 years, but still a zealous servant, related to neighboring influential regents, and of whom favorable testimony has always been given, to a morally quite annihilating treatment. Moreover, you have, when the Resident did not feel inclined to give his consent to your proposals, refused to satisfy the just desire of your superior that you should say openly what you knew of the actions of the native government of Lebak. Such conduct merits all disapprobation, and sanctions belief in your incapacity to bear office in the interior government of Java. I am therefore obliged to dismiss you from your employment as Assistant Resident of Lebak. Yet, in consideration of the favorable reports received formerly of you, I have not found cause to deprive you of the prospect of again getting a situation in the government of the interior. I have therefore given you the temporary appointment of Assistant Resident of Nahuÿ. On your behavior in this office it will entirely depend whether you remain a functionary in the service of the government." And beneath that stood the name of the man on whose zeal, capacity, and good faith the King said that he could rely when he signed his appointment as Governor General of the Dutch Indies. "We go from here, dear Tina," said Havelaar, and he gave the letter to Verbrugge, who read the document with Duclari. Verbrugge had tears in his eyes, but did not speak. Duclari, a very polite and well-bred man, burst out with a wild curse. G I have seen rogues and thieves in the government here. They have gone from here with honors, and to you they write such a letter. It is nothing, said Havelaar. The Governor-General is an honest man. He must be deceived, though he could have guarded himself against that deceit by first hearing me. But I will go to him and show him how matters stand here. He will do justice, I am certain of it. But if you go to Ngawi, I know this for certain. The Regent of Ngawi is related to the Regent of Bantam. I should have to do the same at Ngawi that I have done here. That would be a useless journey. Moreover, it was impossible for me to serve the trial as if I had behaved ill. And, finally, I see that to put an end to all this deceit I can no longer be a functionary. As functionary, there are too many persons between me and the government who have an interest in denying the misery of the population. There are other reasons that prevent me from going to Ngawi. There was no vacancy there. There has been one made for me. Look here. And he showed the Javanese newspaper, which had come by the same post, that indeed, in the same decree of the government whereby he was appointed assistant resident of Ngawi, the assistant resident of that place was appointed to another district where there was a vacancy. Do you know why I have to go to Ngawi, and not to the district where there was a vacancy? I will tell you. The resident of Madiun, to which Ngawi belongs, is the brother-in-law of the late resident of Bantam. I have said that such scandalous things went on here, that the Regent had had such bad examples. Ah, cried Verbrugge and Duclari at the same time. They understood why Havelaar was transferred to Ngawi in particular, to be tried if he would perhaps correct himself. And there is still another reason why I cannot go there, said he. The present Governor-General will soon resign. I do not know his successor, nor what I may expect of him. Note: in the original manuscript the author wrote, I know his successor, I know what I may expect of him. This was changed against the will and without the knowledge of the author. We give this note with the authorization of the author. In order to do something in time for those poor people, I must speak to the present governor before his departure, and if I went now to Ngawi, that would be impossible. Tine, dear Max, you have courage, have you not? Max, you know I have courage when I am with you. Good. He went and wrote the following, in his own opinion an example of eloquence. Rangkas Betong, 29th March, 1856. To the Governor-General of the Dutch Indies. I have had the honor to receive the official letter of Your Excellency of the 23rd inst., No. 54. In reply to that document I feel constrained to beg Your Excellency to grant me an honorable discharge from the service of the government. Signed, Max Havelaar. It needed not so long a time at Buitenzorg to grant the asked-for discharge as was needed to decide how Havelaar's accusation could be turned away. For the latter a month was required, and the news of the discharge arrived in a few days at Labac. God be praised, said Tine, that you can be your own self at last. Havelaar received no instructions to surrender the government to Verbrugge. He therefore awaited his successor. The latter was a long time in coming, because he had to travel from a remote corner of Java. After waiting 3 weeks, the ex officio assistant resident of Labac, who had, however, still acted as such, wrote the following letter to the Controller Verbrugge. Number 153, Rangkas Betong, 15th of April, 1856. To the Controller of Labac. You know that I have received at my own request an honorable discharge from the service of the government by decree of 4th inst., No. 4. Perhaps I should have acted rightly if, on the receipt of this decree, I had resigned my office of assistant resident immediately, as it seems to be an anomaly to fulfill a function without being a functionary. Yet I received no instructions to surrender my office, and partly from the idea of the obligation not to leave my post without being duly relieved, partly from causes of subordinate interest, I waited for the arrival of my successor, thinking that that functionary would arrive soon, at least this month. Now I hear from you that my successor may not be expected so soon. You have, as I think, heard this news at Serang, and at the same time that the Resident was astonished that I, in the very peculiar position in which I am, have not yet asked to be allowed to transfer the government to you. Nothing could be more agreeable to me than this news, for I need not assure you that I, who have declared myself unable to serve otherwise than I have done, who have been punished for this way of serving with censure, note literally for the manner in which I served, with a ruinous and discreditable transfer, with an order to betray the poor men who confided in my good faith, with a choice also between dishonor and starvation, that I had to consider with pains and care everything if it was in harmony with my duty, and that the most simple matter was difficult for me, placed as I was between my conscience and the principles of the government, to which I owe fidelity as long as I am not freed from my functions. This difficulty showed itself principally in the reply which I had to give to plaintiffs. I had once promised to betray nobody to the rancor of his chiefs. Once I had, imprudently enough, given my word for the justice of the government. The poor population could not know that this promise and this bail had been denied, and that I, poor and impotent, stood alone with my desire for justice and humanity. And people went on complaining. It was painful, after the receipt of the missive of 23rd March, to sit there as a supposed refuge, as a powerless protector. It was heartrending to hear the complaints of ill-treatment, extortion, poverty, hunger, whilst I myself had, with a wife and child, to meet hunger and poverty. Neither could I betray the government. I might not say to these poor people, "Go and suffer, for it is the will of the government that you should suffer extortion." I might not avow my impotence, one as it was with the shame and unconscionableness of the Governor General's counselors. Here is what I replied: I cannot help you immediately, but I will go to Batavia. I will speak to the Governor about your misery. He is just, and he will assist you. Go now quietly to your home. Do not oppose, do not remove, wait patiently. I hope that justice will be done. So I thought, ashamed as I was of the violation of my promise of help, to bring my ideas in harmony with my duty to the government, which pays me still this month, and I would have continued thus till the arrival of my successor, if a particular occurrence had not obliged me to-day to put an end to this equivocal position. 7 persons have complained. I gave them the above-mentioned reply. They returned to their homes. The district chief met them on the way. He must have forbidden them to leave their village again, and taken away, as I am told, their clothes, to oblige them to remain at home. One of them escaped, came to me again, and declared that he did not dare to return to his village. What I ought to reply to this man I did not know. I could not protect him. I might not avow my impotence. I would not prosecute the accused chief, because this would have appeared as if the matter had been picked up by me pour le besoin de ma cause. I did not know what to do. I charge you, until further instructions from the Resident of Bantam, with the government of the district of Lebak, from tomorrow morning. The Assistant Resident of Lebak. Signed, Max Havelaar. Then Havelaar departed with wife and child from Rangkas Bitung. He refused all escort. Duclari and Verbrugge were deeply touched at the leave-taking. Max was likewise moved, above all when he found at the first stage a great number of persons who had gone secretly from Rangkas Bitung to bid him a last farewell. At Serang the family was received into the house of Mr. Slingering with the ordinary Indian hospitality. In the evening many visitors came to the residence. They said they had come to say farewell to Havelaar, and Havelaar received many an eloquent shake of the hand. But he had to go to Batavia to speak to the Governor-General. When they arrived there he sought for an audience. This was refused him because His Excellency had a pain in his foot. Havelaar waited till the foot was cured, then he again sought an audience. His Excellency had so much to do that he had been obliged to refuse an audience even to the Director General of Finance, and could not see Havelaar. Havelaar waited till His Excellency should have struggled through all this. Meanwhile he felt something like jealousy for the persons who had to help His Excellency in his labor, for he liked to work quickly and hard, and generally so much business disappeared under his hand. This was, however, out of the question. Havelaar's labor was heavier than labor. He waited. He waited. At last he again sought an audience. He received an answer that His Excellency could not see him, as he had too much to do, being on the point of departure. Max sought the favor of His Excellency to be heard for half an hour as soon as there should be some space between two businesses. At last he heard that His Excellency would depart the next day. That was a thunderbolt for him. Still he believed with spasmodic energy that the resigning governor was an honest man and had been deceived. A quarter of an hour would have sufficed to prove the justice of his cause, and it appeared that this quarter of an hour would not be granted to him. I find among Havelaar's papers the copy of a letter which he seems to have written to the retiring Governor-General on the last evening before his departure to the mother country. In the corner I find the words written in pencil, "Not exact," which gives me to understand that some phrases were changed in copying. I make this observation in order that no doubt may arise regarding the authenticity of the other official documents which I have communicated, and which have all been signed by another hand for exact copy. I mention this because of the want of literal conformity with this document. Perhaps he to whom this letter was addressed may feel inclined to make public the exact text. Then one may see how far Havelaar deviated from this copy. Batavia, 23 May, 1856. Your Excellency, my official request by missive of 28th February to be heard on the affairs of Lebak has remained unanswered. Neither has Your Excellency thought fit to grant my repeated request for an audience. A functionary who was favorably known to the government, I quote Your Excellency's own words, one who has served his country in these regions for 17 years, one who not only never neglected his duty, but who conceived what was good with unexampled self-sacrifice, and who chose to sacrifice all for honor and duty, such a one Your Excellency has placed beneath the criminal, for the criminal is at least heard. That they have deceived Your Excellency with regard to me I understand, but that Your Excellency did not catch the opportunity to escape from this deceit I do not understand. Tomorrow Your Excellency goes from here, and I may not let you depart without having said once more that I did my duty, only my duty, with judgment, with calmness, with humanity, with moderation, and with courage. The grounds on which is based the censure contained in Your Excellency's missive of 23 March are entirely invented and false. I can prove this, and it would have been proved already if your Excellency had granted me half an hour's interview, if your Excellency could have found half an hour to do justice. This you could not, and an honest family has been ruined. Yet I do not complain of this, but your Excellency has sanctified the system of abuse of power, of plunder and murder by which the poor Javanese suffer, and I complain of that. That is what I complain of. Your Excellency, blood cleaves to the money saved out of the Indian salary thus earned. Once more I beg for a moment's interview, be it this night, be it early tomorrow. And again I do not ask this for myself, but for the cause which I defend, the cause of justice and humanity, which is, at the same time, the cause of good policy. If your Excellency can reconcile it with your conscience to depart from here without hearing me, mine will be quiet in the persuasion that I have endeavored all that I could to prevent the sad bloody events which will soon be the consequence of the self-willed ignorance in which the government is left as regards the population. Signed, Max Havelaar. Havelaar waited that evening. He waited the whole night. He had hoped that perhaps anger at the tone of his letter would bring about what he had tried in vain to obtain by moderation and patience. His hope was vain. The Governor-General departed without having heard Havelaar. Another Excellency had retired to the mother country to rest. Havelaar wandered about poor and neglected. He sought. Enough, my good Sterne. I, Multatuli, take up the pen. You are not called upon to write Havelaar's biography. I created you. I brought you over from Hamburg. I taught you good Dutch in a very short time. I made you kiss Louise Rosemeyer, of the Rosemeyers, who trade in sugar. It is enough. Sterne, you may go. This Shawman and his wife. Stop, miserable spawn of dirty covetousness and blasphemous hypocrisy. I created you. You have grown into a monster under my pen. I am disgusted with my own creation. Choke yourself with coffee and begone. Yes, I, Multatuli, who have suffered much, I take the pen. I do not make any excuses for the form of my book. That form was thought proper to obtain my object. That object has a double end. In the first place I would bring forward something which may be preserved as a holy Pusaka by little Max and his sister when their parents have died of sheer want. I would give to these children a testimonial from my own hand. And in the second place I will be read. Yes, I will be read. I will be read by statesmen, who are obliged to pay attention to the signs of the times, by men of letters, who must also peep into the book of which so many bad things are said, by merchants who have an interest in the coffee auctions, by ladies' maids who read me for a few farthings, by governors general in retirement, by ministers who have something to do, by the lackeys of these excellencies, by mutes who, more majorum, will say that I attack God Almighty, where I attack only the God which they made according to their own image, by the members of the representative chambers, who must know what happens in the extensive possessions over the sea which belong to Holland. I shall be read. When I obtain this I shall be content, for I did not intend to write well. I wished to write so as to be heard, and as one who cries, "Stop, thief!" does not care about the style of his impromptu address to the public, I too am indifferent to criticism of the manner in which I cried my "Stop, thief!" The book is a medley. There is no order, nothing but a desire to make a sensation. The style is bad, the author is inexperienced, no talent, no method. Good, good, all very well, but the Javanese are ill treated. For the merit of my book is this, that refutation of its main features is impossible, and the greater the disapprobation of my book, the better I shall be pleased, for the chance of being heard will be so much the greater, and that is what I desire. But you whom I dare to interrupt in your business, or in your retirement, ye ministers and governors general, do not calculate too much upon the inexperience of my pen. I could exercise it, and perhaps by dint of some exertions attain to that skill which would make the truth heard by the people. Then I should ask of that people a place in the representative chambers, were it only to protest against the certificates which are given vice versa by Indian functionaries; to protest against the endless expeditions sent and heroic deeds performed against poor, miserable creatures whose ill treatment has driven them to revolt; to protest against the cowardice of general orders that brand the honor of the nation by invoking public charity on behalf of the victims of inveterate piracy. It is true those rebels were reduced by starvation to skeletons, while those pirates could defend themselves; and if that place were refused me, if I were still disbelieved, then I should translate my book into the few languages that I know, and the many that I yet can learn, to put that question to Europe, which I have in vain put to Holland; and in every capital such a refrain as this would be heard: "There is a band of robbers between Germany and the Scheldt." And if this were of no avail, then I should translate my book into Malay, Japanese, Sundanese, Alfoer, Boiji, and Bata; and I should sharpen Klewangs, the scimitars, and the sabers, by rousing with warlike songs the minds of those martyrs whom I have promised to help. I, Multatuli, would do this. Yes, delivery and help, lawfully if possible, lawfully with violence if need be; and that would be very pernicious to the coffee auctions of the Dutch Trading Company. For I am no fly-rescuing poet, no soft dreamer, like the down-trodden Havelaar, who did his duty with the courage of a lion, and endured starvation with the patience of a marmot in winter. This book is an introduction. I shall increase in strength and sharpness of weapons according as it may be necessary. Heaven grant that it may not be necessary. No, it will not be necessary, for it is to thee I dedicate my book, William the Third, King, Grand Duke, Prince, more than Prince, Grand Duke and King, Emperor of the magnificent empire of Insulind, which winds about the equator like a garland of emeralds. I ask thee if it be thine imperial will that the Havelaars should be bespattered with the mud of the Slimmerings and Drystables, and that thy more than 30 millions of subjects far away should be ill-treated and should suffer extortion in thy name? End of Chapter 20, and end of Max Havelaar, or The Coffee Auctions of the Dutch Trading Company, by Multatuli, translated by Alphonse Nahuÿs.